At the wedding, the groom was so overwhelmed with stress that he stumbled onto the stage like a wooden log. The moment his friends and family witnessed his odd behavior, laughter filled the room. His father sat in embarrassment. Just as the bride entered the scene, another incident took place. Her father, in his excitement, accidentally stepped on her flowing dress, causing her to stumble and fall after just a few steps. But when the bride looked up and saw her groom's wide-eyed, panicked face, she couldn't help but smile. Despite the mishaps, with a series of awkward yet unforgettable moments, their wedding came to a close. After the chaotic yet joyful day, they believed life after marriage would be peaceful, filled with love and happiness. However, reality had other plans. Jingu was a dedicated mother, devoting herself entirely to her child. She spent every moment with the baby, even bringing the child with her when she went to the bathroom. The baby would cry if she left it alone for even a minute, so she found herself holding the child while trying to use the toilet. One day, her husband walked by and saw this, but instead of understanding, he turned away in frustration. He questioned why she had to bring the baby everywhere, even to the bathroom. His complaint stung, and Jingu felt a deep sadness, too exhausted to even respond. As she sat down to take a simple bite of hot rice, the baby's cries interrupted her again. With no other option, Jingu cradled the child in one arm while trying to eat with the other. Tears welled up in her eyes as she ate her bland meal. The light in their house had been broken for a long time, but her husband didn't seem to care. He was always enthusiastic at work, putting in extra effort there, but at home, he was indifferent. As Jingu pushed her child along the street in a stroller, she couldn't help but notice the other women around her. They were well-dressed, carefree, and they moved with an ease she no longer had. She felt a pang of envy. The women glanced at her, but not with understanding. Instead, they looked at her stained clothes, marks from feeding her child. Embarrassed, Jingu tried to rub the stain away with her fingers, but it didn't come off. It made her feel even more disheartened. As she walked, watching people pass by on the bustling street, she remembered a time when she too was young, vibrant, and carefree. But now, just a few short years later, she had transformed into a woman that others saw as worn out, burdened, and tired. That night, her baby became sick, vomiting uncontrollably after eating something bad. The baby's cries echoed through the small house, and Jingu's heart broke seeing her child in pain. In a panic, she called out for her husband, desperate for his help, but her calls were in vain. Bondo, her husband, was out, drinking and singing with his colleagues, ignoring the ringing of his phone. He was too absorbed in his night of fun to answer. Left with no choice, Jingu rushed her baby to the hospital on her own. The anxiety was suffocating, and she could only whisper, "I'm sorry, my dear," over and over as they waited. She had left so quickly that she hadn't even had time to change out of her slippers. Fortunately, after the examination, the doctor told her the baby's condition wasn't serious, and relief washed over her. Returning home exhausted, Jingu noticed a letter on the table. Curious, she opened it and found a credit card bill. As she skimmed through the charges, her heart sank. The bill was filled with hotel payments. Just as Jingu was lost in thought, her phone suddenly rang. It startled her, pulling her attention away from the silence in the room. She glanced at the screen. It was her best friend. Without thinking much, Jingu opened the message. What appeared next took her breath away. Her friend had sent her a photo. In that photo, there was a man Jingu knew too well. It was her husband. The moment her eyes registered what she was seeing, her heart felt as if it shattered into a million pieces. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. Tears welled up in her eyes, disbelief clouding her mind. How could this be? The man she had loved and trusted, how could he be someone like that? She slowly lifted her gaze, her tear-filled eyes catching her own reflection in the mirror. She looked nothing like the woman she used to be. Somewhere along the way, she had lost herself. Walking down the street, people probably mistook her for someone old and forgotten. The realization hit her hard, and her tears began to fall, one by one. At that exact moment, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Bando, her husband. He simply told her he wouldn't be coming home that night. Jingu felt her chest tighten, her heart aching to the point where it almost felt like it would stop. How could things have reached this point? When a wife realizes her husband has another woman, it feels like her whole world is falling apart. Jingu could no longer control her emotions. Desperate for answers, she dialed Bando's number, her hands trembling. When he picked up, her voice cracked as she asked him, "Why are you doing this to me? What have I done wrong?" She was met with nothing but cold indifference. Instead of comforting her or explaining himself, Bando turned the blame on her. "What about me?" he snapped. "Do you even know how I'm treated out there? I'm not even treated as well as a dog. Do you know what I've had to endure?" His words cut deep. He even went as far as to say that his life had been ruined ever since he met her. Hearing those cruel words, something inside Jingu broke. She could no longer hold on to the pain. She made a decision, one that felt both painful and inevitable. Through sobs, she told her husband, "Let's get a divorce. We aren't happy together. We should have never met in the first place." Her voice trembled with the weight of the words, but there was a strange sense of clarity in them. Bando, upon hearing this, was left devastated. He couldn't understand how things had reached this point. He didn't even realize what he had done wrong. But the truth was, all along, his actions had been slowly tearing their relationship apart. He had just been too blind to see it. Not long ago, on their wedding anniversary, Jingu had quietly hoped that Bando would remember the day, that maybe, just maybe, he'd surprise her with something special. But when the day came, Bando couldn't even recall a single word about it. Jingu felt the disappointment sink in like a stone. Later that evening, Jingu noticed a gift box in Bando's bag. Her heart fluttered for a moment. Could it be an anniversary gift for her? But before she could touch it, Bando rushed over and grabbed it out of her hands. It turned out the gift wasn't for her at all. It was for the wife of his company leader. Jingu's heart ached at how coldly Bando treated her, the woman he had vowed to cherish. Overcome with frustration, Jingu grabbed Bando's notebook in a fit of anger, intending to throw it into the water basin. That notebook was more precious to Bando than anything else. It contained all his notes on the leader's preferences and the tasks he needed to complete at work. But in her fury, Jingu didn't care about any of that. She yelled at him, "Am I supposed to rely on this notebook to survive? Even if I sold gum on the streets, I'd still make more than you." Her harsh words stung. She called him useless and stingy, lashing out in her pain. Bando, unable to hold back his own rage, shouted back, "If anything happens to that notebook, we're getting divorced." His words shocked Jingu into silence. In her moment of disbelief, the notebook slipped from her hands and fell into the water basin. The ink on the pages bled and blurred, rendering the notes unreadable. Despite his desperate attempts to salvage it, the damage was done. The notebook was ruined. Because of it, Bando missed an important opportunity with his leader. In his frustration and desperation to save face at work, Bando resorted to drastic measures, drinking alcohol and even slapping his own face to apologize. But no matter what he did, he couldn't erase the fact that his mistakes had cost him. To make matters worse, every time the leader faced a problem at work, Bando was the one who took the blame. He had become nothing more than a scapegoat. Yet, in all of this, neither Bando nor Jingu could see that their marriage had long been eroding, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing. That night, the hospital director, worried his wife might discover his affair, asked Bando to take the woman away and keep her hidden. However, standing on the street, the woman refused to leave, insisting on staying. At that moment, the director's wife suddenly appeared. Without hesitation, she rushed over and attacked the woman in a fit of rage. Bando, trying to calm the situation, stepped in to stop the fight, but things quickly took a turn for the worse. The director's wife grabbed Bando by the throat, choking him. As he struggled to break free, he accidentally pushed her to the ground. Just then, the director arrived and saw what had happened. Angered by the sight, he rushed at Bando and punched him. Later, when the director and Bando sat together drinking, the director tried to justify his actions, saying he had no choice but to use force. But deep down, Bando felt that the director had crossed a line. Filled with frustration, Bando excused himself to go to the bathroom, fuming inside and plotting to confront the director. However, the moment he stepped back into the room, reality hit him hard. He knew he couldn't act on his anger. Instead, he had to bow his head, plaster a fake smile on his face, and pretend everything was fine. Even when the director mocked him repeatedly, Bando could only manage a weak, forced smile to cover up his humiliation. Later, Bando sat in his car, looking at the bruise on his face. Ashamed to return home in this state, he called his wife to say he wouldn't be coming home that night. Unfortunately, his simple explanation made his wife, Jingu, jump to the wrong conclusion. She assumed that he was hiding something, that perhaps he had someone else in his life. This misunderstanding led to a tragic situation. Neither Bando nor Jingu wanted to confront the issue. One refused to ask and the other refused to explain. The next day, they both went to the courthouse to file for divorce. After signing the papers, Bando hoped to say something meaningful to end things on a peaceful note. But Jingju, feeling deeply betrayed, could only respond with sarcastic and hurtful remarks. Still, as they were about to part ways for good, Bando softly said, "I hope you'll find happiness." Once a happy couple, their marriage crumbled simply because they couldn't communicate. One refused to ask, and the other refused to speak. This silence, in the end, led to their separation. That evening, after returning home, Bando stared at his wedding ring, feeling a painful sense of loss. Unable to bear it any longer, he pulled the ring off his finger and threw it out of the window. At the same time, Jingju was sitting on a bus, holding her own wedding ring. She stared at it for a long moment before finally letting it slip from her hand, watching it fall onto the road. What neither of them could have known was that their actions triggered something extraordinary. Their discarded rings somehow unleashed a mysterious magical force, causing a powerful earthquake that shook both their homes. This earthquake, however, wasn't just any ordinary one. It sent both Bando and Jingju back in time. The next morning, Bando, unaware of what had just happened, went to the grocery store to pick up breakfast. But as he looked at the expiration date on the food, he was shocked. It read, 1999. Confused, he turned to the shopkeeper, asking if there was a mistake. The shopkeeper, unfazed, assured him that it was the newest stock available. As Bando looked around, he noticed something even stranger. The shopkeeper herself appeared much younger than she had the day before. Startled by this discovery, Bando began to realize that something extraordinary had happened. But the shopkeeper, confused by his reaction, couldn't understand why he seemed so disturbed. Bando was in shock when he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. His reflection was no longer that of a man his age. It was much younger. Confusion gripped him, and he rushed home, desperate to find his mother. As he stepped inside his house, his disbelief only grew. His parents appeared before him, looking exactly as they had years ago. His heart raced as his eyes darted around the room, finally landing on the calendar hanging on the wall. It read 1999. At the same time, Jinggu was just waking up. As she opened her eyes, she saw the impossible. Her mother, long deceased, was standing right in front of her. Jinggu stared at her mother's face, unable to believe what she was seeing. For so long, she had thought her encounters with her mother were merely dreams. And yet, here she was, standing close enough to touch. Even if it was all a dream, Jinggu couldn't help but wrap her arms around her mother, holding her tightly. Tears welled up in her eyes as Jinggu began to apologize, confessing that she never got the chance to tell her mother that she had recently divorced. She had tried to live happily, but things had spiraled out of control. In her sorrow, Jinggu muttered that maybe she would be better off leaving this world and following her mother into the afterlife. Her mother, hearing her daughter's words, was startled and confused. She didn't understand what was going on, and in her bewilderment, even thought that Jinggu might be cursing her to die. Angry and upset, her mother scolded her harshly. It was then that Jinggu realized something was wrong. She quickly backed away, feeling the weight of her own pain. Her mother, seeing her daughter's odd behavior, grew even more alarmed. Fearing that Jinggu was possessed by some spirit, she moved towards her, ready to strike her a few more times to bring her back to her senses. In that moment, it dawned on Jinggu that this wasn't a dream after all. She caught her reflection in a nearby mirror and saw that she too looked much younger. The calendar on the wall confirmed her suspicion. It was 1999. Everything around her had changed. Her clothes were now the school uniform she had worn years ago, and her bookshelf was lined with novels she had once read as a student. Slowly, it sank in. Jinggu had somehow traveled back in time. The time she had thought was lost forever had returned. A wave of realization washed over her, and she knew, deep down, that she needed to cherish this second chance. Despite her mother's confusion and frustration, Jinggu stayed close by her side, relishing the feeling of having her back. She hadn't experienced the warmth of her mother's presence in so long, and the thought of being able to make new memories filled her with joy. Jingu's mind wandered back to the day of her mother's funeral, when she had stood before her portrait, overcome with guilt and regret. Now, looking at her mother, alive and well, all of those feelings rushed back. But this time, the guilt was accompanied by an overwhelming sense of happiness. Yet her mother didn't share the same emotions. She couldn't understand why Jinggu was acting so clingy and assumed her daughter was trying to get her to buy a new phone. To put an end to her daughter's strange behavior, Jinggu's mother told her husband to hurry and take her to school. When they arrived at the gates of the university, memories flooded Jinggu's mind. The campus felt both foreign and familiar, and a sense of nostalgia washed over her. Meanwhile, Bando had also come to grips with the fact that he had traveled back in time. The thrill of the discovery made him giddy with excitement. He quickly grabbed his school bag, eager to head out the door and relive his youth. But his enthusiasm didn't sit well with his father, who couldn't understand why his son was acting so strangely. Thinking something was seriously wrong with Bando, his father struck him, convinced his son was suffering from a mental breakdown. Bando winced, but the pain only reinforced what he already suspected. This was real. He had truly been transported back to his past. Determined, he made his way to the gates of his old university, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and disbelief. Jingu too found herself standing at those same gates the next day, unsure of what to do next. She had woken up yet again in the year 1999, her mind reeling from the realization. She had returned to her university days, a time that felt both comforting and strange. But what made the situation even more complicated was that her useless ex-husband had also been transported back to the past with her. When Jinju and Bando crossed paths again at the university, neither of them could hide their surprise. Their eyes widened as they came face to face with someone they had once shared every moment of their lives with. But the only memory that filled their hearts was that of their divorce. Neither wanted to relive that painful chapter. And so, as they moved towards each other, their steps slowed. Just as they were about to meet, they passed each other as though they were complete strangers. Bando felt a sense of relief wash over him, thinking Jinju hadn't recognized him. At the same time, Jinju was also comforted, hoping Bando didn't know who she was either. She silently wished that she would never have to know him again in this lifetime. As her thoughts drifted, Jinju noticed a handsome guy on the soccer field. A flood of memories hit her. This was the same man who had once confessed his feelings to her. Back then, she had turned him down without a second thought. Now, looking at him from afar, regret stirred within her. Just as her mind began to replay that moment, the guy, Nam Gil, caught her gaze. Flustered, he quickly turned away, avoiding eye contact. Jinju, however, wondered if his reaction was due to shyness, and the thought amused her. Lost in her thoughts, Jinju was suddenly interrupted by her best friend, Bo Room, who approached her excitedly. Jinju, seeing her younger, 18-year-old best friend, couldn't contain her joy. She began stroking Bo Room's face repeatedly, as though in disbelief, causing Bo Room to question if something was wrong with Jinju. Without another word, Bo Room grabbed Jinju and dragged her towards the lecture hall. As they entered the lecture hall, Jinju spotted Nam Gil once again. Memories from 20 years ago came rushing back. The missed opportunity, the chance she didn't take. But this time, she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. Determined, Jinju walked up to Nam Gil and greeted him, leaving everyone who witnessed the scene in shock. The female students in particular stared at Jinju with jealousy, their expressions filled with bitterness. After all, Nam Gil was the heartthrob of the university, admired by many. Nam Gil, however, found the situation amusing. He smiled at Jinju's sudden boldness. Meanwhile, Bo Room, ever the best friend, began filling Jinju in on what had happened. Apparently, the night before, Nam Gil had confessed his feelings to Jinju in front of a crowd of other female students. But Jinju had rejected him for a rather odd reason. She couldn't stand the strong smell of his sweat. Upon hearing this, Nam Gil's face turned red with embarrassment, and Jinju couldn't believe her ears. Listening to her best friend recount the events, Jinju was filled with a deep sense of regret. How could she have been so foolish back then? Yet Bo Room, noticing Jinju's strange behavior throughout the day, grew increasingly concerned. Jinju finally decided to reveal the truth. She explained to Bo Room that she had time traveled from 20 years in the future, back to this very moment. Of course, Bo Room didn't believe a word of it, brushing off the wild tale as a joke or some form of stress. Desperate to convince her friend, Jinju insisted that she had traveled back in time from the future, even from a day after her divorce. But despite Jinju's insistence, both Bo Room and their other close friend remained skeptical. They began to think Jinju was losing her mind, so they decided to take her out for a meal, hoping she would come back to her senses. Jinju, left feeling helpless and misunderstood, had no choice but to follow them to the dining hall. Yet, as she walked down the hallway, lost in her thoughts, a hand suddenly grabbed her, pulling her back to reality. Jinu's journey into the strange twists of time seemed to bring her unexpected romantic encounters. It all started when a handsome young man at school came up to her and confessed his feelings. He admitted that he had been watching her for a while, and now gathering the courage, wanted to ask for her phone number. Jinwoo, surprised but delighted, felt a warm flutter in her heart. It was a moment every girl dreams of. However, something awkward crept in. Since she had just traveled through time, she couldn't quite remember whether she even had a phone in this era. Caught in the moment, she told him that she didn't have a phone number and couldn't recall any landline details either. The air hung still for a moment. Then, as if on cue, the sound of a text message notification suddenly rang out from somewhere nearby. The young man's eager expression shifted almost immediately upon hearing the sound. His excitement drained from his face, and without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving Jinwoo standing there in stunned silence, unable to explain. She barely had a chance to react before he was out of sight. Despite the sudden shift, Jinwoo's friends, who had been watching from a distance, were overcome with jealousy. It was clear to them that Jinwoo's romantic fortune was blooming, but the awkwardness of the situation was lost on her as she stood there, caught in the whirlwind of time travel. Meanwhile, Bando, Jinwoo's husband, found himself in a completely different scenario. Since traveling back to his university days, he felt like a fish out of water. Everything around him seemed odd and unfamiliar, as though he didn't belong in this time. The most jarring moment came when he spotted his friend Jae-woo, wearing what seemed like a bizarre outfit. Bando couldn't help but laugh and mock Jae-woo, asking if he had dressed up as a chick for some strange reason. Jae-woo, however, was not amused and quickly fired back, questioning if Bando had forgotten he used to wear similar clothes. Bando laughed it off, confidently stating that he would never be caught wearing something so ridiculous. Feeling smug, Bando walked into the classroom, only to be hit with the reality of the situation. The chick costume was actually the official class uniform, and he was the only one not wearing it. The class monitor noticed Bando's lack of uniform and wasted no time in reprimanding him. But Bando, stubborn as always, wasn't about to take orders so easily. In his mind, he scoffed at the class monitor's attitude, thinking, "Who does this guy think he is, acting all high and mighty?" Despite his thoughts, Bando couldn't help but burst out laughing, which only made the class monitor more uncomfortable. Trying to smooth things over, Bando casually explained that he was in a hurry and simply forgot to put on the uniform. The class monitor, unimpressed, asked if Bando understood why the entire class was standing there, enduring punishment. Before Bando could respond, another student, who had remained quiet, spoke up. He explained that it was because a new student had gotten into a fight with a senior the night before. Bando, without thinking, passionately chimed in, criticizing the student for being arrogant enough to disrespect a senior. He went on a mini rant about how students these days didn't know the meaning of respect. But before he could finish, the class monitor, visibly annoyed, cut him off, revealing that it was, in fact, Bando who had caused the trouble. It turned out that during dinner the previous night, Bando overheard some seniors making fun of their uniform, calling it a chick costume. Enraged by their words, Bando had gotten into a physical altercation with them. As a result, the entire class was now being punished for his actions. One mistake, and everyone had to suffer the consequences. Just as the situation couldn't get worse, the same seniors from the night before stormed into the classroom, armed with sticks and brimming with anger. Their presence was intimidating, and they were clearly seeking revenge. They shouted for Bando to come forward and face them. The air in the classroom thickened as the seniors laid into Bando and the others, forcing them to endure a grueling stance exercise while being scolded relentlessly. Minutes dragged on, and one student, finally reaching his limit, begged the seniors to stop, asking how much longer they had to endure the punishment. The tension in the air was palpable, as Bando realized that his hot-headedness had led to this mess. While Jinwoo was tangled in her unexpected romantic fate, Bando found himself facing the harsh consequences of his actions in a time that no longer felt like his own. The senior stood before the group, sternly reminding them of the rule. As long as no female student entered the room, they were to hold their stance. The group knew that the civil engineering department wasn't exactly teeming with female students, so they braced themselves for an uncomfortable, extended wait. Just then, as if by some strange coincidence, a girl with long flowing hair that reached her waist appeared in the hallway. Every pair of eyes in the room locked onto her, silently willing her to open the door and enter the room. The tension in the air was palpable, and the hope that she would walk in lingered on everyone's faces. But then, something completely unexpected happened. The classmates' hopes were dashed when a boy entered instead. causing a wave of disappointment so intense that some even briefly entertained thoughts of wanting to leave this world altogether. Bando, on the other hand, found the situation hilarious, especially as the girl with waist-length hair had unintentionally poked fun at him. He couldn't stop laughing, his laughter so loud and uncontrollable that it became impossible to close his mouth. This laughter, though unintentional, only worsened the seniors' anger, and they decided to punish Bando even further. After what felt like an eternity, the punishment finally ended. Wanting to make peace with his friends, Bando decided to buy them drinks as a gesture of goodwill. As they exited the building, a figure passed by, and Bando felt a strange sense of familiarity wash over him. Curiosity got the better of him, so he followed the person. To his surprise, it was none other than his superior, the same person who had previously used him as cannon fodder. Now that their paths had crossed again, Bando knew he couldn't let him off so easily. The superior was busy talking with his girlfriend when Bando approached, pretending to accidentally bump into him. As an apology, Bando handed over a can of soda, but this was no ordinary can of soda. While walking, Bando had been shaking the can repeatedly, venting his frustration. When the superior opened it, the soda sprayed everywhere in a chaotic explosion, much to Bando's satisfaction. Later, Bando returned to the classroom, only to be greeted by an excited classmate who shared some thrilling news. There would be a meet and greet with female classmates that night. The idea of mingling with new people immediately lifted Bando's spirits, and he could hardly contain his excitement. But just as he was savoring the idea, he turned around, and there she was, his ex-wife, Jinju. The two locked eyes, and both silently wished they would never have to see each other again in this lifetime. It was as though fate was toying with them. To make matters worse, during the evening meet and greet, they found themselves seated at the same table. The awkwardness between them was unmistakable. Each one thought the other hadn't traveled back in time with them, and the discomfort between them was growing by the minute. To their horror, their classmates suggested playing a pairing game. Jinju and Bando did everything they could to avoid being paired together, but fate had other plans. To their dismay, they were indeed paired, and the irritation they already felt for each other intensified as they sat there, glaring. The more they stared, the more annoyed they became with one another. Bando, envisioning the trouble this could cause him in the future, wanted nothing more than to escape. With a mocking tone, he attempted to reject Jinju, hoping to sever whatever connection remained. But Jinju, determined not to be outdone, fired back at Bando without hesitation. Their heated exchange grew, and just as Bando was about to storm off, he couldn't resist throwing in one last comment. "Today, I'm breaking up with you." With those words, he turned and walked away, leaving Jinju standing there, stunned and confused. She stood still, trying to process what Bando had just said. The realization of his words hit her slowly, and a strange, uncomfortable feeling settled in her chest. She couldn't understand why she had fallen for someone so immature and childish. As Bando walked away, a small sense of satisfaction flickered within him. He had finally managed to defeat Jinju once, something he had never accomplished before. The thrill of victory, however, was short-lived. Just as he began to enjoy the moment, he caught sight of a familiar figure in the distance. It was his first love. Her silhouette and that captivating face stopped him in his tracks, leaving him speechless. Without thinking, he hurried after her, gently pulling her closer as he asked if she remembered him. So Young responded with a faint smile, saying that she did, but not very clearly. Bando, undeterred, smiled warmly and said it didn't matter. His eyes were fixed on her, a surge of happiness radiating from him. As they stood there, lost in their brief reunion, neither of them noticed that someone else had witnessed this encounter. Jinju, Bando's ex-wife, had seen it all. Seeing her former husband be so kind and attentive to another woman stirred a whirlwind of emotions within her. Even though their marriage was long over, jealousy clawed at her heart. Unable to bear the sight any longer, she turned and walked away. Jinju found herself wandering along a quiet bridge, her thoughts consumed by the past. She couldn't help but wonder if Bando's journey back in time had been solely to reconnect with his first love. If he had cared for her so deeply, why had he stayed with Jinju for so many years? The more she thought about it, the worse she felt. Her heart grew heavy with confusion and pain. As if things weren't difficult enough, a familiar sound reached her ears. It was the voice of her child, or so it seemed. In her daze, she thought she saw her own child standing on the bridge, looking at her. But the cruel reality hit her like a wave. That child wasn't hers. It belonged to someone else, the The sight and the sounds brought Jingju's emotions crashing down. The pain became unbearable, and she burst into tears, her sobs echoing in the stillness around her. Though she had traveled back in time, Jingju's heart remained tethered to her child in the future. The distance between them only deepened her sorrow. She missed her child desperately, worried about what might be happening in her absence. Her one hope was that this entire experience, this time travel, was nothing more than a fleeting dream. She longed to wake up and find herself back in her own time, back with her child. These thoughts swirled endlessly in her mind, consuming her until she could no longer hold back. Collapsing onto the bridge, she wept uncontrollably, her body shaking with the force of her grief. Eventually, Jingju managed to pull herself together and stumbled towards a nearby car. Tears blurred her vision as she opened the door, believing it to be a taxi, but it wasn't. It was Nam Gil's car. Nam Gil, who had been quietly watching her from the driver's seat, was at a loss. Seeing Jingju in such distress, he wasn't sure what to say or do. In the end, he simply started the car and drove her home, hoping his silent presence would offer her some comfort. Wanting to lighten the mood, he turned on a gentle song, hoping it might soothe her, but it didn't. Jingju's tears continued to fall throughout the entire ride, the sadness within her too deep to be eased by music or kind gestures. When they finally reached her home, Nam Gil spoke softly, telling her she had arrived. Jingju, lost in her own thoughts, pulled out a bank card and handed it to him. Mistaking him for a taxi driver, Nam Gil was taken aback, his expression freezing in surprise. He gently returned the card, shaking his head, signaling that it wasn't necessary. Jingju, still crying, accepted the card back without a word and stepped out of the car. Nam Gil watched her retreating figure, concern etched across his face. He couldn't begin to understand what she was going through, the weight she carried inside her heart. Once home, Jingju entered the quiet of her apartment, her mind still swirling with emotions. She opened a letter she had written long ago, a farewell letter addressed to her mother. She had written it, fearing that one day she might never return from this strange journey through time. The thought of leaving the people she loved, of never returning to the present, haunted her. With the letter in her hand, she walked to the living room and knelt before her mother, gazing up at her with pleading, innocent eyes. Jingju wished with all her heart that her mother could stay with her forever. That time would stop, and they would never be separated again. But deep down, she knew that time had its own plans, and all she could do was hope for the strength to face whatever lay ahead. As for the mother, when she saw her daughter like that, she had no idea what was wrong with her that night. She lay in bed, concerned and unsure, and asked her husband if by chance she had given her daughter something wrong to eat. Jingju lay right next to her, and the mother, turning to her daughter, looked at her with love and affection. Just seeing her child made her heart fill with happiness. Jingju, like a small child, snuggled up in her mother's arms. It seemed that no matter how old children get, they are always their mother's little ones. Meanwhile, it was already past midnight, but Bando sat in his room, deep in thought. He was worried about whether, if he went to sleep, he might time travel again. The idea of returning to the future filled him with anxiety. He imagined being divorced and how his life would no longer be as it was now. He desperately wanted to stay in the present. To avoid falling asleep, he took 2 matchsticks and propped open the corners of his eyes, trying to keep himself awake. But despite all his efforts, he eventually drifted off, still wide-eyed. The next morning, Jingju woke up and realized she hadn't time traveled either. Her heart was heavy from all the crying she had done the previous night, and her eyes were swollen and red. Bando also woke up, and when he realized he was still in the present and hadn't gone back to the future, he was overjoyed. So much so that he almost lost his mind with excitement. This excitement sparked an idea in him. He gathered his entire family together and, full of confidence, asked his parents to hand over all their family assets. He promised them he could multiply the money many times over, making everyone rich beyond their wildest dreams. He even suggested they invest in Chinese real estate, assuring them that its value would skyrocket in the future. But his bold plan wasn't met with enthusiasm. His parents, instead of being impressed, were furious. His father became so angry that he almost fainted. Unable to bear his son's outlandish claims any longer, he grabbed a hammer, ready to teach him a lesson and knock some sense into him. Yet Bando remained oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Realizing his father was truly angry this time, he quickly ran out of the house to escape his father's wrath. Meanwhile, Jingju was on her way to school in a taxi. When the taxi reached the school gate, she tried to pay the driver using her bank card. But to her surprise, The driver froze, confused. He told her this was a taxi, not a supermarket, where she could swipe her card. Jingju was taken aback. She clearly remembered swiping her card without any problems the night before. So why wasn't it working now? Left with no other choice, she began searching through her bag, hoping to find some cash. But no matter how hard she looked, she couldn't find a single coin. Then it hit her. She had accidentally dropped her wallet in the taxi the previous night. Luckily, after checking her jacket pocket, she found a $5 bill, just enough to pay the driver. Relieved, she handed it over and stepped out of the taxi, entering the school grounds. As she entered, something immediately caught her eye. It was Nam Gil, the handsome guy she secretly admired. Seeing him walking toward her, her heart raced. Panicked, she quickly ducked behind a trash can, hoping to stay hidden. From her hiding spot, she quietly watched Nam Gil from a distance, her eyes filled with admiration. Just as she was watching him, lost in her thoughts, Bando's close friend and his group of buddies suddenly appeared nearby. Jingju, not wanting to be seen or draw attention to herself, nervously kicked her leg to chase them away. But in an ironic twist of fate, Nam Gil witnessed the whole scene from afar. Nam Gil couldn't stop wondering why he kept running into that strange girl. The thought occupied his mind as he quickly left, eager to distance himself from the confusion. As soon as he was out of sight, Jinju finally released a long, relieved breath. Ever since Nam Gil's departure, she had been holding it in, anxious in his presence. Meanwhile, Bondo, after traveling back in time, made a firm decision. He was determined to pursue his secret love for the beautiful and graceful Soyoung, whom he had adored from afar for what seemed like forever. One day, as Soyoung practiced her dance with passion, Bondo couldn't help but watch her from the back door. His heart raced as he saw her movements flow effortlessly. He thought to himself, if only I had been with Soyoung from the beginning, our future would be filled with happiness. This hope fueled Bondo's courage. Determined to speak to her, he gathered every ounce of bravery and walked toward Soyoung. Nervous but sincere, Bondo approached her, apologizing for his rude behavior the night before. He handed her a drink he had bought just for her and said, "I'm sorry about last night. I brought this for you." Then, with a small smile, he added, "There's enough for your friends, too." After making his apology, Bondo turned to leave, but a sudden impulse made him stop. He spun around and asked, "Could I have your phone number? That way, next time we meet, we'll already know each other a bit better." Later, when Bondo recounted the entire encounter to his friends, they couldn't believe a word he said. They doubted his story, thinking he was exaggerating or making it up entirely. Dop J, one of his closest friends, was so skeptical that he decided to dial the number Bondo claimed was Soyoung's. To his and everyone's amazement, Soyoung herself picked up the call. After hearing her voice, Bondo's friends finally believed him and immediately began begging him for advice. Proud of his accomplishment, Bondo eagerly shared every detail of how it all happened. However, just as Bondo was in the middle of excitedly telling his story, Jinju showed up. She came with the intention of having a civil conversation, but Bondo had no interest in talking to her. Annoyed and unwilling to deal with her, he used the excuse of needing to attend class and refused to engage with her. This brush-off infuriated Jinju, and in response, she decided to mock him by sending an anonymous letter. It wasn't until then that Bondo realized something shocking. Jinju had also traveled back in time, just like him. After class, he confronted her, pulling her aside to talk. Bondo couldn't help but be impressed by her acting skills, admitting that for a moment, he almost didn't recognize her. Sarcastically, he called her a scary woman. The two of them began exchanging insults, both too stubborn to back down. However, beneath the harsh words, Jinju had a deeper reason for seeking Bondo out. She wasn't interested in fighting with him. She simply wanted to figure out how to return to the future. But to her disappointment, Bondo had no answers. He didn't know how to get back either. In fact, he admitted that he wasn't eager to return to the future at all. He even suggested that staying in the past might be better because then they wouldn't have to worry about getting divorced again. Jinju fell silent, not sure how to respond to his remark. In the end, the two of them came to an agreement. From that point on, they would stay out of each other's way, each living their own separate lives. But deep down, both of them wondered if their fate would really end there. Could they really just go on without ever crossing paths again? Jinju, having been sent back to her university days, was determined to make the most of this second chance. She wanted to fix the things she regretted and live out the moments she had missed. One of her first desires was something simple, but meaningful. She wanted to wear high heels to the nightclub, a small but significant act of confidence she had never embraced before. So, together with her two closest friends, Jinju put on her high heels, ready for a fun night out. As they left the dormitory, excited and a bit nervous, they suddenly came face to face with a steep, 60-degree slope. The moment they saw it, all three girls stopped in their tracks, frozen in place, unsure of how to tackle the challenge in their fashionable but impractical heels. It was Jingu's first time wearing high heels, and she didn't give it much thought as she confidently strode toward the slope. Her two close friends, on the other hand, were far more cautious. They tiptoed carefully, step by step, clearly aware of the challenges high heels presented, trying to avoid any missteps that could lead to a fall. But despite their experience, it was Jingu who found herself in trouble. Suddenly, Jingu lost her balance, but just before she could fall, a handsome man named Nam Gil caught her. She was safe, but the situation left her feeling deeply embarrassed. Nam Gil, noticing her awkwardness, jokingly said that if she could stand properly, she should let go of him because, as he claimed, he had a sour body odor. Blushing and flustered, Jingu quickly let go of his arm and apologized repeatedly, explaining that it was her first time wearing high heels. She reassured him that he didn't smell sour at all. Nam Gil said nothing further and simply walked away, leaving Jingu standing there, feeling awkward. Coincidentally, this entire scene had been witnessed by Bondo and his two close friends, Dojae and Jayu. After watching Jingu's embarrassing encounter, Dojae humorously remarked that maybe they should try the same thing next time, hinting that love might find them too if they tried wearing heels in such places. Jayu found the idea amusing and agreed enthusiastically, but Bondo didn't seem particularly thrilled by the suggestion. Later that evening, Jingu and her friends headed to a nightclub. It was Jingu's first time in such a lively, bustling place, and her curiosity was evident. She looked around in awe, fascinated by everything, even picking up the table lamp and shaking it, completely unaware that this action was a signal to call for service. Within moments, a waiter approached, asking Jingu if she needed anything. Her friend Borum quickly stepped in and explained that it was Jingu's first time at a nightclub and that she had made the mistake unintentionally. The waiter, realizing they were new to the scene, asked Jingu if she was interested in chatting with any guys. Jingu, ever the innocent and excitable one, eagerly agreed and followed the waiter into a private room. Unbeknownst to her, the future club director had already noticed her, and the waiter led Jingu and her friends to a room occupied by a man named Hunk. As soon as they entered the room, Borum, more street-smart than Jingu, immediately sensed Hunk's intentions. He was clearly trying to flirt with them, but Jingu, being naive and trusting, didn't think anything of it and reassured her friends that everything was fine. Boram, however, was worried that if they stayed any longer, Jingu might get into trouble, so she quickly suggested that they head outside to dance instead. Just as they were about to leave the private room, Hunk handed Jingu a piece of paper with his contact information written on it. Jingu, still unaware of his true motives, took the note and followed Borum to the main hall. In the main hall, the three friends joined the crowd, dancing enthusiastically to 90s disco hits. The lively music and vibrant atmosphere lifted their spirits, and they let loose on the dance floor. However, as they were dancing, they spotted Bando and his group nearby. Jingu's two friends decided to go over and have some fun with Bando's group, but Jingu stubbornly refused to join them. She didn't want to see Bando, and instead chose to sit outside, quietly drinking by herself. Inside the room, Bando noticed Borum and remembered how formidable she was when it came to drinking. Not wanting to challenge her, he stayed quiet. Dojae, sitting next to him, was unaware of Borum's drinking prowess and suggested a drinking contest. No matter how much Bando tried to signal to Dojo to reconsider, Dojo paid no attention and confidently started the contest. It didn't take long before Borum easily outdrank Dojo, leaving him passed out on the table. Just as the drinking contest concluded, a waiter rushed into the room, informing them that one of their friends had drunk too much and was in trouble. Jinju, completely drunk, staggered onto the stage, clutching the microphone. Her voice was loud, chaotic, making everyone in the room burst into laughter. But then, in her drunken state, her mood shifted. She began shouting at Bondo, calling him a miser and blaming him for ruining her life. The crowd watched, unsure if they should laugh or feel awkward. "Everything is your fault, Bondo," she slurred. "What about our daughter, Sojin? What are you planning to do about her?" Hearing his daughter's name, Bondo was hit with a wave of realization. Although he had traveled back in time, he hadn't considered what would happen to his child. Still living in the future, his heart sank as he thought about her. Even though his life was moving forward in this timeline, his child remained in the distant future, unreachable. The weight of it all brought tears to his eyes. He wiped them away, but the sadness lingered, heavy in his chest. Determined to return to the future and be with his daughter again, Bondo decided to confront Jinju the very next morning. He wanted to have a serious talk with her about Sojin and figure out what they could do. He found her early, still weary from the night before, and pulled her aside into an empty room. There, away from the chaos, they began to speak honestly. The emotions they had bottled up for so long came pouring out. They talked about everything, their broken marriage, their regrets, and most importantly, their daughter, Sojin. Both Bondo and Jinju felt the weight of their failed relationship, but what they didn't realize was that they weren't truly alone. The room they had chosen was actually the school's broadcast room, and every single word they spoke was being transmitted to the entire school. Their secrets spilled into the airwaves, echoing through every hallway and classroom. Students all across the school heard every intimate detail of their conversation. Even their first loves, So Young and Namal, were stunned to hear the revelations. Bondo and Jinju, still deep in conversation, were completely unaware of what had happened. Meanwhile, outside the door, their classmate Chinu overheard everything too. As soon as the broadcast ended, gossip spread like wildfire. The entire school buzzed with talk about the scandal. Whispers and rumors filled every corner of the campus. When Bondo walked into his classroom, his friend Jae-woo eagerly asked him if he had heard the latest gossip that had everyone talking. Confused, Bondo asked what he meant. Jae-woo grinned and explained that there were rumors about 2 students at their school who had gotten divorced and even had a child. Bondo froze, shocked by the bizarre coincidence. How could students at their age be involved in such a complicated situation? Jae-woo shrugged, saying the real shock wasn't their age, but that after their divorce, both of them had found new love. Bondo felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. How could such a thing happen? He tried to make sense of it, but then, as Jae-woo continued, everything clicked. Jae-woo casually mentioned that the girl had called the guy a miser, accusing him of being useless. Bondo's heart dropped. Those were the exact words Jinju had shouted at him the night before. How could Jae-woo possibly know that? Bondo, growing more anxious, asked how Jae-woo had learned all this. Jae-woo simply pointed to the school's PA system. And then it hit him. The entire school knew. The argument, their personal history, it had all been broadcast for everyone to hear. Bondo's face paled as the full weight of the situation sank in. Across the school, Jinju sat in her classroom, hearing the students gossip about the mystery couple. Even though no one knew it was her, she felt a deep sense of embarrassment wash over her. She wanted to disappear. Later, during lunch, Bondo deliberately sat next to Jinju, shooting her a glance that clearly asked, "What do we do now?" Jinju looked back at him, just as confused and helpless. There was no easy solution. Meanwhile, Chino, sitting nearby, was glaring at Bondo with pure fury. Unlike everyone else, she knew exactly who the couple was. Her anger simmered, knowing that Bondo and Jinju were the ones everyone was gossiping about. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, Chinu's frustration boiled over. She shot Bondo a withering look and snapped, "You're such a scumbag!" Her words hung in the air, cutting deep into the already tense atmosphere. Bondo was utterly confused, and Jinju was equally surprised. Chinel had always been calm and quiet, so it was hard to understand why she was suddenly acting so harshly. Despite the confusion, Chinel kept muttering under her breath, calling Bondo a scumbag. Her words were sharp and biting, unlike anything they had ever heard from her before. After she finished her tirade, Chinel fixed Bondo with a fierce gaze that made him too scared to even look up. Time passed, and the memory of the incident gradually faded from everyone's minds. Soon enough, it became nothing more than a forgotten story, and Bondo and Jinju could finally breathe a sigh of relief. However, no sooner had they found peace than Bondo rushed off to meet the girl of his dreams. Determined to impress his crush, he bought a huge pile of snacks and drinks for her and her group of friends. After all, there was an old saying, if you want to win over a girl, you have to win over her friends first. Bondo approached the group confidently, offering a cake to his crush, So Young. But to his surprise, she politely declined, worried it might affect her weight. Bondo, understanding her concern, didn't push her. He simply smiled and turned to leave, thinking that was the end of it. But just as he was walking away, So Young suddenly collapsed, fainting right there on the ground. Bando was shocked and immediately rushed to her side, scooping her up and carrying her to the nearest infirmary. The nurse quickly realized that So Young had not eaten for a long time, starving herself in an attempt to control her weight. When So Young finally regained consciousness, the first sound that filled the room was her stomach growling from hunger. Seeing that she was awake, Bando decided to take her to a nearby barbecue restaurant. He hoped that if she ate something, she would feel better. But even there, So Young remained stubborn, determined to stick to her strict diet. She refused to touch any of the food, even as the delicious smell of grilled meat filled the air. Bando, seeing her resolve, decided to playfully tease her. He sat across from her, eating the meat with such obvious enjoyment that it made So Young visibly uncomfortable. Occasionally, he would look at her and say, "Just one bite. You know you want to try it." At first, she resisted, but Bando's playful persistence slowly wore her down. Finally, with a defeated sigh, she said, "Fine, just one piece." She picked up a piece of meat and gingerly placed it in her mouth. The moment she tasted it, a look of satisfaction spread across her face. The flavor was too good to resist. Bando smiled, feeling relieved that she had finally eaten something. They continued eating, and for a while, everything seemed fine. But as soon as they were done, So Young's worry crept back in. She frowned, touching her stomach, and complained, "I've probably gained a few pounds." Hearing this, Bando chuckled and reached into his bag. He pulled out a pair of sneakers and handed them to her with a grin. "Now that we're full," he said, "how about we burn off those extra calories together? Let's go for a run." So Young looked at the sneakers and then at Bando, unsure whether to laugh or protest. But in the end, they both knew it was the perfect solution to their little problem. So Young was walking down the street with Bando, and her curiosity got the best of her. She turned to him with a playful smile and asked, "Where did the sneakers come from? And how did you even know my shoe size?" Bando, without hesitation, replied that he had, of course, bought the shoes himself. As for the size, he added with confidence, "I could tell just by looking." So Young couldn't help but laugh at this. "There's no way you can know my shoe size just by looking," she teased. But Bando, quick as ever, responded, "If your heart is in the right place, there's nothing you can't know." Hearing this, So Young felt a wave of warmth. His words touched her deeply. They continued their walk and soon found themselves climbing up a mountain, where they could see the entire city spread out beneath them. The view was breathtaking, and So Young thought to herself how perfect the moment was. She felt a sense of peace and beauty she hadn't experienced in a long time. Bando stood beside her, leaning against the railing, silently watching her. In that quiet moment, his heart swelled with happiness, wishing that time could somehow stop, that this perfect moment could last forever. As the day came to an end, Bando walked So Young to the bus stop. She turned to him, eyes bright with gratitude, and said, "Thank you for today. I had such a great time. You're the first person in a long time who's made me feel this way." Her words filled Bando with joy. His heart raced, feeling that everything he had done was completely worth it. But as he watched her board the bus and disappear into the distance, the smile on his face slowly faded. When he turned around, his mood shifted as he saw his future in-laws standing across the street. The sight of So Young's father and mother instantly made him uneasy. He hadn't expected to see them, and his nerves got the best of him. As they passed by, Bando quickly turned his back and stood still, staring blankly into space. He hadn't seen them in so long, and the encounter left him unsettled. The very next day, Bando found himself standing quietly outside his future in-law's house. He didn't want to be seen, but he couldn't resist observing from a distance. As he watched, a stranger suddenly bumped into So Young's mother. The man didn't back off, which caused her to panic, unsure of what to do. Without a second thought, Bando sprang into action. He rushed over, pushed the stranger aside, and sternly scolded him. The stranger, clearly taken aback, shouted, "Who do you think you are to interfere in other people's business?" Bando, without missing a beat, replied, "I'm her son. Is there a problem with that?" The stranger, realizing he had no ground to stand on, backed off. So Young's mother, however, was left standing there in shock. She didn't know Bando at all, and his sudden appearance left her completely confused. Bando, noticing her puzzled expression, suddenly found himself flooded with memories. Memories of her passing away when he was in college. The flashback was almost overwhelming. Back in his college days, there was a mysterious legend about the library. It was said that at night, strange and eerie sounds would come from the building, leading many students to believe the place was haunted. Senior students whispered stories of ghosts and supernatural happenings, making the library a place of fear for most. One day, Jinu's classmates decided they'd had enough of the rumors and planned to uncover the truth. They dared one another to go inside the library to retrieve a book, thinking it would be a fun challenge. But once inside, the spooky atmosphere got the better of them. Several friends were so terrified that they ran out in a panic, their courage quickly vanishing. However, Jinu was different. She didn't believe in ghosts or evil spirits. Determined to prove the rumors wrong, she confidently walked into the library. But just as she entered, a book suddenly fell from the shelf, crashing to the ground. The noise startled her, and for a brief moment, she froze. But then, a wave of recognition hit her. She had been in this very spot before. Memories of a past event flooded her mind. She recalled a time when, under threat, she had discovered that the so-called ghost was nothing more than a prank set up by her senior to frighten them all. Thinking of this, Jinu regained her composure and decided to turn the tables. She began to outsmart the senior who had planned to scare her. Little did the senior know, she had seen through the whole charade. While he crouched behind a chair, waiting for the perfect moment to strike fear into her, Jinu was already one step ahead. The day's events, both in the past and present, swirled through his mind, and he couldn't shake the intensity of the moment. In a surprising twist, everything took a sudden turn. In the end, he wasn't the one scaring her. She was the one who frightened him. The two seniors who had been terrorizing others in the library were suddenly struck with fear by Jinju. They screamed and dashed out of the building, terrified beyond words. Perhaps for the rest of their lives, they would never dare set foot in that library again. After handling the troublemakers, Jinju turned her attention back to her goal, finding the red envelope that symbolized victory. She eventually found it, but just as she reached out to grab it, disaster struck. Jinju lost her balance and tumbled down the stairs, but just in time, her savior appeared. As she looked up, Jinju was startled to see the young man standing before her. She scrambled to her feet and backed away quickly, only to bump into a ladder, causing it to collapse. Because of her clumsiness, Namgil got hurt. Jinju felt a wave of guilt wash over her as she noticed him massaging his ankle in pain. Rushing to his side, she checked and saw that his ankle was swollen. Namgil, being tough, tried to brush it off, insisting that he was fine, but Jinju wouldn't hear it. She insisted on helping him up, determined to take him outside and get help. Later on, her bravery did not go unnoticed. Her classmates threw her a special celebration for her courageous act. They all praised Jinju for her bravery, expressing their admiration for her. Jinju, modest as always, downplayed the situation, saying there was nothing to fear about ghosts. The scariest thing, she added, is people. As she said this, her eyes drifted toward Namgil. Remembering his injury, Jinju hurried over with an ice pack. Namgil, of course, was still trying to act tough, dismissing the need for the ice, but Jinju wasn't having it. Out of patience, she grabbed his leg, lifted it onto a chair, and applied the ice pack herself. Once that task was done, she went right back to the celebration, toasting enthusiastically with her classmates and with Namgil. Watching Jinju, Namgil couldn't help but feel something shift inside him. He looked at her in a new light, wondering what made this girl so different, so special. As the party went on, Jinju drank a little too much, eventually becoming quite tipsy. Namgil, amused by her drowsy state, found her all the more endearing. After the celebration ended, he quietly followed her to see how she handled herself while drunk. On the bus ride home, Jinju absent-mindedly breathed on the window and drew a tiny footprint with her finger. Her thoughts drifted to her child, and a deep sadness overcame her. She missed her child terribly. Thinking about her little one, now over 2 years old, made her feel an overwhelming sense of worry. Tears welled up in her eyes, and Namgil silently witnessed her heartbreak. Finally, when Jinju made it safely home, Namgil felt a wave of relief and left. Meanwhile, her ex-husband, Bando, sat alone, drowning his sorrows in alcohol. Both he and Jinju had traveled back 20 years in time, but their child remained in the future. Every time they thought of their child, both Jinju and Bando felt their hearts break a little more. This was why Jinju curled up in bed, sobbing uncontrollably. The next morning, she awoke with a jolt, hoping it had all been a dream. But when she realized she was still in the past, the weight of it hit her all over again, and she burst into tears. Hearing her sobs, her mother rushed into the room, her worry etched across her face. Jinju's strange behavior had been a growing concern, and seeing her daughter in this state only heightened her fears. When Jinju saw her mother's worried face, guilt consumed her. She could no longer hold it in and leaned forward, wrapping her arms around her mother. She clung to her, knowing what it felt like to lose her. Jingju had been feeling incredibly blessed to have her mother by her side once more. It seemed like a gift from heaven itself, a second chance she never thought she'd get. Determined to do everything in her power to protect her mother, she took her to the hospital for a thorough examination. But when the doctor came back with the results, Jingju's heart sank. Her mother's condition was serious, and the doctor explained that she would likely need long-term treatment, possibly for the rest of her life. Worried, Jingju pressed the doctor for more details. She asked if complications might develop 10 years down the road if her mother underwent dialysis. The doctor didn't sugarcoat the situation. There was always a chance of complications, not just in the distant future, but perhaps even as soon as tomorrow. The weight of his words crushed Jingju, and she couldn't help but ask if there was anything that could be done to minimize those risks. The doctor offered a sliver of hope. If they continued treatment diligently, her mother could live a long life, maybe even reaching 100 years old. But even with this small bit of optimism, Jingju realized deep down that her mother's fate was uncertain. The idea that there was no real way to fully save her filled Jingju with a heavy sense of guilt. Later, as she visited her mother's hospital room and saw her lying there, frail and vulnerable, that guilt became almost unbearable. She didn't know what to do, how to ease her mother's suffering, or how to prepare for the inevitable. With these dark thoughts clouding her mind, Jingju found herself sitting alone in the school cafeteria, her sadness evident. This didn't go unnoticed by Namgil, who happened to walk by. Seeing her sitting there, looking so lost, he grabbed a tray of food, sat down beside her, and casually said, "Eating alone is pretty boring, don't you think?" Jingju wasn't really alone, but before she could respond, Namgil awkwardly realized he was the one without company. Quickly trying to recover from his slip, he added, "Well, I'm the one eating alone anyway." Soon, Namgil, Jingju, and her two close friends shared the meal together. Her friends were thrilled to be eating with Namgil, a handsome senior they rarely had a chance to spend time with. After finishing their food, Namgil told Jingju to come with him, which left her confused. She didn't know why he was suddenly so interested in her, but she followed him anyway. Curiosity getting the best of her, Jingju finally asked him why he was paying attention to her all of a sudden. Namgil's answer took her by surprise. "Because you were flirting with me." Jingju was stunned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Flirting? That couldn't be right. She had never flirted with anyone in her life. She quickly defended herself, explaining that whatever had happened earlier in the library was purely accidental, but Namgil didn't seem convinced. Trying to change the subject, Jingju asked if his leg was feeling better and reminded him to apply ice regularly, warning him that neglecting it could lead to complications later. Namgil chuckled at her concern and teased her again, saying, "See? You're flirting with me." Flustered, Jingju denied it immediately, but Namgil kept up his playful banter. He even claimed his leg still hurt, and each step caused him pain. Concerned, Jingju moved closer to check on him, her natural worry taking over. This caught Namgil off guard, and he instinctively stepped back, startled, nearly limping away from her. Later, Namgil went to the school bathroom, ready to take a shower. Just as he was about to undress, he overheard a conversation happening nearby. Two guys were talking, and it didn't take long for Namgil to realize they were talking about Jingju. One of them, Hook, was bragging about how he had met a girl named Jingju a couple of days ago and how innocent she seemed, suggesting it was the perfect opportunity for some fun. Namgil's anger flared instantly. He clenched his fists, trying to control his rising rage. At the same time, Bondo, who had been sitting quietly across from the two, heard everything. Bondo was Jingju's ex-husband, and upon hearing these guys disrespecting her, he couldn't hold back his fury. Without a word, he kicked one of the guys, sending him straight into the swimming pool. Still fuming, Bondo stormed out of the bathroom, anger boiling in his veins. He had no time to deal with them anymore. Instead, he had plans for the night, plans with his first love, Soyoung. They were supposed to see a movie together, and he didn't want anything to ruin the evening. But as they got on the bus to head to the theater, the driver's poor driving made things awkward. The bus jerked and swayed, causing Soyoung to repeatedly fall into Bondo's arms. Each time it happened, she became more embarrassed, her cheeks flushing red as she tried to regain her balance. Bondo, noticing the situation, quickly stepped in and said that if someone were to fall and get hurt, the person suffering would be Soyoung. Embarrassed yet comforted by his words, Soyoung grabbed onto Bondo's arm. The two, feeling a bit awkward but close, then headed to the movie theater. As they arrived, Bondo was about to buy the tickets when, to his shock, he turned around and saw none other than his future father-in-law. Startled, he immediately fled to the bathroom, overwhelmed by panic. Once inside, Bondo took a deep breath and calmed himself down, reminding himself that his future father-in-law didn't actually know him at this point. There was no reason to be afraid. Feeling a bit silly for panicking, he cautiously peeked out of the bathroom, making sure the coast was clear. However, just when Bondo thought he was safe, he saw Jingju and Nam Gil, who were also there to watch a movie. Jingju, curious, turned to Nam Gil and asked, "Weren't we supposed to go to the hospital? How did this turn into a movie night?" Nam Gil, with a grin, said watching movies was good for health, adding that it might even help his leg heal faster. Jingju wasn't buying it and found his reasoning ridiculous. But before she could say anything more, her eyes landed on Bondo. The two exchanged subtle, almost playful signals from across the room. Jingju, trying to stir things up, brought up the time Nam Gil had confessed his feelings for her and cheekily suggested that they should date. Bondo was fuming upon hearing this. He had always believed he was Jingju's first love, and now it seemed like Nam Gil had swooped in halfway and messed things up. Jingju, clearly trying to provoke him, made Bondo feel even more upset. Unable to hold back, he started to retaliate with his own remarks, which only escalated the tension between them. Jingju, growing angrier, gave Bondo a sharp look. Later, the two couples ended up in the same movie theater. While the movie was a tearjerker, with almost everyone in the theater sobbing, Bondo and Jingju remained unmoved, finding the film completely unremarkable. In fact, Bondo wasn't even focused on the movie. The entire time his eyes were glued to Jingju, unable to think about anything else. Once the movie ended, they all walked out together, and just then, Bondo's worst fear came true. Jingju's father suddenly approached him. Out of habit, Bondo greeted him, but quickly realized his mistake when Jingju's father gave him a confused look and asked, "Who are you?" Embarrassed, Bondo stammered, saying he was just a passerby, and hurriedly ran off to avoid further awkwardness. Meanwhile, Jingju's father was eyeing his daughter and the young man she was with, Nam Gil. Jingju, sensing her father's suspicion, quickly explained that Nam Gil was just a senior from school. But then her father's attention shifted to the jacket Nam Gil was holding. He looked at it curiously. Nam Gil explained that since he had injured his leg, Jingju had been kind enough to carry his jacket for him. Jingju tried to reassure her father not to read too much into it, insisting that Nam Gil was merely a senior and nothing more. Her father, though still slightly concerned, asked her to come home with him. Jingju, however, gently declined, saying she could make her way home on her own. Her father, although reluctant, respected her decision and turned to leave. As soon as Jingju's father was out of sight, Nam Gil visibly relaxed, feeling much more at ease. Later, Jingju and Nam Gil went to a restaurant. While sitting at the table, Jingju couldn't shake the feeling that Nam Gil might be faking the extent of his leg injury. She teased him, saying she suspected his leg wasn't really hurting all that much. Nam Gil, amused, asked if she was really that concerned about his injury. Jingju, with a smirk, replied that it was only natural to care, especially since it was partly her fault that he got hurt in the first place. Nam Gil was left utterly speechless upon hearing the words. He stood there, stunned, thinking to himself about how irresistibly adorable Jinggu was. Meanwhile, Jinggu, feeling the intensity of Nam Gil's gaze, couldn't help but grow shy and embarrassed. Her cheeks flushed, and she quickly looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Desperately wanting to distract from her awkwardness, she nervously offered to pay for their meal and asked Nam Gil what he wanted to eat. Without hesitation, and quite unexpectedly, Nam Gil responded bluntly, "I want to eat you." Jinggu was completely taken aback by his bold words. She froze, not knowing how to respond. The moment lingered awkwardly for a moment, but soon after, Nam Gil escorted her home, all the way to her doorstep. When they arrived, he kindly wished her a pleasant evening, his voice soft yet sincere. With a small smile, Nam Gil turned to leave, but as he began walking away, only a few steps down the road, a firm hand suddenly grabbed his arm. Startled, Nam Gil turned around, and to his surprise, it was Jingu's father. Tension immediately washed over him. Jingu's father, with a stern expression, asked him what they had done after watching the movie. Nam Gil, trying to remain polite and calm, answered respectfully, "We only went for a drink." But that wasn't enough to ease Jingu's father's suspicions. He pressed further, interrogating Nam Gil about his drinking habits and asking questions about his family background. as soon as he found out that Nam-gil's father was the director of the school. Jingu's father's mood shifted drastically. Excitement filled his eyes, and his attitude towards Nam-gil changed completely. Suddenly, he was more than just polite. He became enthusiastic. He even went as far as to ask Nam-gil with genuine curiosity if he truly liked his daughter, Jingu. Nam-gil, not one to hide his feelings, openly admitted his affection for her without hesitation. The next morning, Jingu made her way to the bus stop, heading to school. As she stood there waiting, she spotted So-young, who had coincidentally arrived at the same stop. Jingu noticed So-young carefully folding her umbrella and placing it into her bag. Admiring her preparedness, Jingu thought to herself, "This girl really knows how to plan ahead." Soon after, Bondo also arrived at the bus stop, catching Jingu's eye. Watching him approach, a sudden thought crossed her mind. Is this how people get what they want? Like a crying baby getting milk? She pondered. But just as she was lost in her thoughts, Jingu's own umbrella suddenly broke. Rain poured down, drenching her completely, and she was left standing there helpless, unsure of what to do. The storm continued to soak her, and just when she felt at her most defeated, Nam-gil appeared like a guardian angel, covering her with his umbrella. His presence felt like a blessing in that moment, lifting her spirits. With Nam-gil by her side, they walked together toward the school. Jingu couldn't help but notice that as they walked, Nam-gil kept tilting the umbrella toward her, ensuring she stayed dry, even though his own shoulder was getting soaked by the rain. His selflessness didn't go unnoticed. Jingu saw his drenched shoulder, and, feeling a pang of guilt, she quickly moved closer to him, wanting to shield him from the rain as well. As they continued walking, they spotted Bondo and So-young walking in the opposite direction, sharing an umbrella. The two couples passed each other on the street, and as they exchanged glances, a strange sense of jealousy sparked between them. It was a fleeting but undeniable feeling, something neither could fully understand. Not long after, they all arrived at the classroom. Bondo, upon seeing Nam-gil's wet shoulder, couldn't help but feel a sting of disdain. He eyed Nam-gil, muttering to himself while measuring Nam-gil's shoulder width with a pen, thinking, his shoulders aren't that much broader than mine. Meanwhile, Jingu, seated behind Bondo, noticed that his shoulder was also wet from the rain. As she observed this, memories flooded her mind. She recalled how, in the past, whenever it rained heavily, Bondo would always bring 2 umbrellas. He would give her one, but never offered to share his own umbrella with her. The thought made her pout with frustration. She muttered quietly to herself, annoyed at Bondo's lack of consideration, cursing him under her breath as useless. Soon after, the school's annual festival arrived. The air was filled with excitement and joy, as the event was as vibrant as a local fair, complete with games, food, and performances. Everyone gathered to celebrate, their spirits high as they enjoyed the festivities together, each student finding their place in the lively atmosphere. At the university, students were encouraged to join extracurricular activities to make their campus life more enjoyable. Jinju, eager to explore the excitement, decided to join her close friend. As they wandered through the lively festival, they spotted 2 female students struggling to carry a heavy crate of drinks. Without hesitation, Jinju rushed over to help them. She had always been the type to lend a hand whenever someone was in need. If she noticed a student unsure of how to cook, she would step in to offer her expertise. It was during one of these moments of kindness that Nam-gil happened to notice Jinju. The way she selflessly helped others left a strong impression on him, making him see her in a new, more admirable light. Later on, Jinju had the opportunity to showcase her cooking skills. When the students gathered around to watch her prepare a dish, they were all astonished by her precise and skilled techniques. She moved with confidence and ease, creating a fragrant plate of stir-fried pork with chili. The delicious aroma filled the air, and soon the dish was ready. With a smile, Jinju picked up a piece of the stir-fried pork and offered it to her classmates. As they tasted it, their faces lit up in surprise at how flavorful it was. Nam-gil stood nearby, expecting that his turn would come soon. But just as he was about to open his mouth to taste the food, one of the juniors beat him to it, grabbing a bite first. The junior exclaimed that Jinju's cooking was so good, it should be the main course of the festival. Hearing this, Jinju laughed and playfully responded, "This is just the first dish. If I made more, you'd all be even more amazed." Just as she was about to offer a bite to Nam-gil, one of her classmates interrupted, much to his frustration. The interruption left Nam-gil feeling slightly annoyed, as he had been eagerly waiting for his turn. Meanwhile, Bondo arrived at the festival with So-young by his side. excited to take part in the activities. Like a child in a playground, Bondo eagerly led So Young around, trying out various games and attractions. As they wandered around, Jinju happened to spot them, her eyes lingering on the pair for a moment. Eventually, Bondo made his way to the section of his department, where he encountered a group of upperclassmen. However, the upperclassmen, noticing that all the other students were busy helping with the festival activities, saw Bondo on what appeared to be a date. This made them furious, and they scolded him for not helping. Jinju, curious about the commotion, came over to see what was happening. When she arrived, she mentioned that she wanted to join in the fun and take part in the game. However, Jinju had a specific target in mind for the game: Bondo. The game involved throwing water balloons, and Jinju wasted no time aiming them directly at her ex-husband. Each throw was precise, hitting Bondo squarely. It became clear that Jinju's accuracy came from the years she had spent honing her skills while taking care of their child. Not a single shot missed. So Young, standing nearby, couldn't bear to watch any longer. She approached Dojae and suggested that they change the target of the game. Feeling sympathetic, Dojae turned to the upperclassmen, pleading to make the change. But Jinju wasn't interested. With a smirk, she firmly declared that she didn't want to throw at anyone else. Her target was Bondo, and no one could change that. Later that night, Bondo and Jinju found themselves sitting at the same table, the mood tense but playful. Bondo, always one to tease, began to deliberately provoke Jinju. Just as the conversation grew more lighthearted, So Young arrived, looking for Bondo. The moment Bondo saw her, he called her over, his tone welcoming. Jinju, sensing the moment, gracefully stood up to give them space. At the same time, Nam-gil walked over to join them. With So Young seated beside Bondo, the two began chatting happily, their laughter filling the air. Meanwhile, Nam-gil sat nearby, watching Jinju as she prepared food. Throughout the evening, Jinju couldn't help but glance over at Bondo and So Young, her mind drifting back to memories of a rainy morning. As she continued to cook, her thoughts lingered on Bondo and Nam-gil, both of whom were watching her closely. That morning, the memory lingered in Nam-gil's mind. After Jinju finished cooking, he walked over to her, gently taking her hand, expecting her to feed him. But just as he looked over at Bondo, something triggered a memory: the incident at the swimming pool earlier that day. It dawned on him that Jinju's relationship with Bondo might not be as straightforward as it seemed. There was an underlying tension between the two, something complex and unspoken. Jinju and Bondo, though, seemed completely unbothered by this realization. They kept pushing each other's buttons, teasing and provoking without hesitation. Just as Bondo threw a mocking comment at Jinju, a classmate from the student council showed up, looking for her. It turned out the school was organizing a beauty contest, but their department didn't have anyone participating. Naturally, they thought of Jinju. However, Jinju immediately declined. She said her appearance wasn't anything special, and besides, her clothes were dirty. That's when Namil appeared out of nowhere, holding a fresh set of clothes. "These are extra clothes I had in my car," he said casually. Jinju shot him a questioning look, wondering why on earth he had women's clothes in his car. Namil simply shrugged and explained that they belonged to his sister. Jinju hesitated. Should she enter the contest or not? Before she could decide, Bondo chimed in with his usual smugness. "You won't win the queen title. Honestly, you'll be lucky if you're not last." Jinju, feeling her competitive spirit rise, fired back. "What if I win first place?" Without missing a beat, Bondo replied, "Then I'll become your pet." Hearing this bold claim, Jinju made up her mind. She would enter the contest. When she changed into the elegant dress Namil provided, with her hair cascading down her shoulders, the transformation was unbelievable. She looked stunning, like a goddess. Even her ex-husband, who had known her for years, couldn't believe what he was seeing. His eyes widened in disbelief as he turned to his best friend and asked, "Is it really possible for girls to look this beautiful just with some makeup?" His friend had no idea how to respond. Jinju, now standing on stage, felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. Introducing herself was awkward. She stumbled over her words. Despite her nerves, she looked so radiant that Nam-gil couldn't take his eyes off her. Then, the host asked her if she had any special talents to showcase. Jinju hesitated before responding that she was really good at eating but didn't have any particular skills. The audience chuckled, and Jinju felt like backing out, but the host wouldn't let her leave the stage. Left with no choice, Jinju paused to think. After a moment, she decided to sing. As her voice filled the room, something shifted. The more she sang, the more confident and vibrant she became. Her voice grew stronger, and soon she was lost in the performance. Meanwhile, Bondo sat in the audience, utterly stunned. The Jinju he knew was a housewife, a mother who spent her days caring for her family. Now, she was captivating an entire room with her voice. By the end of her performance, Jinju had won over the crowd, and the title of Beauty Queen. She was now the school's new beauty queen, to everyone's amazement. After the contest, Jinju went to change out of her dress. She headed toward the women's restroom, only to find a closed-for-maintenance sign hanging on the door. Not knowing what else to do, she noticed the men's restroom was empty. In desperation, she slipped inside to change. Just as she was in the middle of changing, Hansu and a few of his friends walked into the restroom, completely unaware she was there. They began casually talking about her, making crude remarks. Hansu, grinning, said that after he was done having his fun with her, he'd let his friends take their turn. Upon hearing these words, Jinju was overcome with fury. Without a second thought, she stormed toward the door, determined to confront whoever was outside and teach them a lesson. But to her surprise, it wasn't just anyone standing there. It was Nam Gil. Just as Nam Gil opened his mouth to speak, someone else suddenly appeared, rushing forward with a sense of urgency. In a moment of panic, he grabbed Jinju and pulled her back inside the room, away from Nam Gil. But the world often works in strange ways, and at that very moment, Bondo slowly opened the door to the restroom. Jinju was caught off guard, unsure how to explain what was happening. Bondo and Nam Gil, however, locked eyes, their gazes sharp and filled with the tension of rivals. The room was thick with unease. As they were about to part ways, Nam Gil, not one to let things slide easily, called out to Bondo with a mocking tone, clearly intending to provoke him. Bondo, never one to back down from a challenge, fired back without hesitation. The situation escalated quickly, and Jinju, realizing how quickly things were spiraling, stepped in, urging Nam Gil to return the clothes to his sister before she realized they were missing. Hearing this, Bondo couldn't resist throwing in a sarcastic remark. What kind of brother keeps his sister's clothes in his car? It's pretty obvious those clothes were meant for someone else, he said with a knowing smirk. Nam Gil, rather than getting defensive, calmly admitted the truth. He had indeed bought the clothes for Jinju. So, you want to live a happy life with that rich, handsome guy, huh? Jinju, caught off guard by Bondo's childish jealousy, felt her temper rise. She glared at him fiercely, her frustration boiling over. Without saying another word, she turned on her heels and walked away, fuming. As she walked off, Jingju's phone buzzed. A message had just come in, and the sender was none other than Huck, the scumbag who had caused her so much grief. Memories flooded back to her. Bondo had warned her about Huck's hypocrisy. She also recalled overhearing things in the restroom that only confirmed what she already knew deep down. There was no longer any doubt. Huck was indeed a scumbag. Determined to get rid of him once and for all, Jingju quickly contacted Bondo, asking for his help in figuring out how to deal with Huck together. But Bondo hesitated. He wasn't keen on getting involved in more drama, especially after he had already gotten his own revenge on Huck. He tried to reason with Jingju, telling her she should focus on herself and let it go. But Jingju couldn't just let it go. She was furious. Huck hadn't just toyed with her emotions. He had used her as a backup option, and that cut deeper than anything. She was determined to make him pay. It wasn't easy for Jingju to ask for help, but she did. Her eyes filled with resolve. In the end, Bondo gave in. He decided he would help her get the revenge she craved. Their first step in their plan was for Jingju to reply to Huck's message, agreeing to meet him that evening. Meanwhile, Bondo took it a step further. He let Huck believe that Jingju was the daughter of the powerful Sang Song group, leading Huck to think he could gain something by pretending to pursue her. That evening, when Jingju and Huck met, she played her part perfectly. She pretended to be engaged in their conversation, making Huck believe that he had her right where he wanted her. Feeling confident, Huck invited her to join him at the group's dinner party later that night. Behind the scenes, Bondo was working on another part of the plan. He arranged to meet Huck's current girlfriend, who had no idea what kind of person Huck really was. At first, she didn't believe Bondo's warnings, but when Bondo revealed that Huck had actually sent him, she finally started to see the truth. Meanwhile, Huck and Jingju arrived at the dinner party together. Everything seemed normal until Huck, clearly up to something, found an excuse to take Jingju away from the crowd and into a more secluded spot. It was there, alone, that Huck confronted her, asking directly, "Why are you trying to get close to me?" Jingju tried to carry on as if she knew nothing, but Hin-suk had already done his research. He discovered that the S-Song group had no daughter named Jingju. When Jingju heard this, she was overwhelmed with panic. She quickly denied it, insisting there had to be a mistake, saying she wasn't who he thought she was. After making this claim, Jingju abruptly ran outside, clearly desperate to escape. However, Hin-suk was quick. He grabbed her arm before she could flee and threatened her. He warned her that if she didn't start telling the truth, he wouldn't hesitate to use violence even against a woman. Just as he was about to raise his hand to strike, 3 women appeared outside. These women were all girlfriends of Huck, and when they saw what was happening, they immediately intervened. Hin-suk had been playing these 3 women, seeing each of them behind the others' backs. None of them knew about the others until this moment. Now, seeing him tangled in yet another mess, they weren't going to let him get away with it. They had every intention of confronting him. Hin-suk, realizing the situation was getting out of control, tried to flee, but there was no escaping the fury of 3 determined women. Despite his attempts to smile and act innocent, it was clear that the truth had come out. The 3 women were furious, and when they learned about his secret dealings, their anger only grew. Panicking, Hin-suk tried to explain the situation to his real girlfriend, but no matter what he said, she refused to believe him. He kept pleading, trying to convince her it was all a misunderstanding. Just then, he noticed Bondo standing nearby, smirking. That's when he realized that this was all a setup. Carefully planned by both Bondo and Jingju, things went from bad to worse for Hin-suk. To add insult to injury, Bondo made a bold claim, saying he was the new boyfriend of Hin-suk's girlfriend. That was the last straw for Hin-suk, who finally snapped and let his true feelings slip out in a fit of rage. His anger, however, only dug his grave deeper. Unable to control himself, Hin-suk lunged at Bondo, but before he could do anything, Jingju intervened. She ran over and kicked Hin-suk, causing him great pain and stopping his attack. With the situation finally under control, Bondo and Jingju decided to leave together. On their way home, Bondo suddenly noticed that Jingju's arm was injured. Concerned, he stopped and asked her how it happened. Jingju glanced at her arm, recalling how it had been injured earlier during her confrontation with Hin-suk. Without hesitation, Bondo rushed to buy some bandages. When he returned, he gently applied them to her arm, carefully tending to her wound. As Bondo focused on her injury, his seriousness caught Jingju off guard. A flood of complicated emotions washed over her. She wished, more than anything, that time could stop in that very moment. Her mind drifted back to when their small family of 3 had been happy. Those days, spent together, had been the happiest of her life. She missed those times dearly. Bondo, too, was lost in memories. He also thought back to the moments of joy they had once shared. Both of them were wondering how things had gone so wrong. Neither could understand why their paths had led them to this painful place. Tears welled up in both their eyes. They were overcome with emotion, but there was nothing left to say. In the end, Jingju decided to leave alone. As she walked away, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, she suddenly realized something terrifying. She was being followed. The fear gripped her heart. She knew who it was. Hin-suk. Ever since she had exposed his lies and deceit, he had been vowing to take revenge on her. Terrified, Jingju quickly grabbed her phone and called Bondo, hoping he could help. But to her horror, Bondo was already on another call and didn't pick up. Her panic increased as Hin-suk grabbed her and dragged her off to a secluded place, leaving her fate hanging in the balance. Henza was furious, his anger nearly driving him mad, as he blamed Jingju for ruining everything. He demanded to know if she had any idea how much effort he had put into dating wealthy women like Ice. But Jingju stood her ground, her expression unwavering. She saw Hensa as a complete failure. Unable to control himself, Hensa raised his hand, ready to strike Jingju. Just then, Namil appeared out of nowhere. Without hesitation, he kicked Hensa, sending him rolling down the slope. But even after that, Hensa was determined to fight. He staggered to his feet, ready to charge at Namil again. However, it was clear to everyone that Hensa was no match for Namil's strength and presence. Namil was prepared to teach him a lesson, but Jingju quickly intervened. She pulled Namil back, scolding Hensa sharply. With the confrontation over, Jingju and Namil left together. Namil, concerned for Jingju's safety, insisted on taking her home himself. As they walked, Jingju suddenly stopped, a thought crossing her mind. She turned to Namil and asked, "Why did you come here, of all places?" Namil, calm as always, said he had just come for a walk. enjoying the fresh air. Jingju gave him a curious look and asked if he had developed feelings for her. Namil smiled softly and reminded her that he had already answered that question before. Jingju, not wanting to lead him on, advised him not to like her. She explained that even though she looked like she was in her 20s, inside, she felt much older. Namil looked confused by her words, and realizing she had said too much, Jingju quickly excused herself, running into her house. The next morning, Jingju's mother came into her room, concerned. She had noticed that something was off about Jingju lately. On top of that, she had overheard Jingju talking in her sleep, calling out the name Seijin. Curious, her mother asked who Seijin was, and if he was the boy who had come to their door some time ago. The mention of Seijin's name brought tears to Jingju's eyes. She tried to hide them, not wanting to worry her mother. Brushing away her tears, she quickly suggested they go to the public bathhouse together. After their bath, Jingju's mother thoughtfully dried her hair. Passers-by smiled at the sight, admiring the close bond between the two. It was a tender moment, the kind of moment Jingju had longed for. Later, the two of them sat outside a small grocery store, enjoying yogurt together. It felt like a perfect, peaceful moment for Jingju. But their peaceful afternoon was interrupted when a mother pushing a baby stroller walked by. Jingju's mother was immediately captivated by the baby, becoming overly excited. Jingju, on the other hand, felt a mix of emotions, both touched and deeply saddened. Out of nowhere, she asked her mother, "Would you be happy if you could see your son again?" Her mother, slightly taken aback, chuckled, and responded that Jingju was still too young to be thinking about children. But then she added, with a warm smile, that if Jingju ever had a child, they would surely be as chubby, fair, and cute as Jingju had been when she was a baby. Hearing her mother's words, Jingju couldn't help but think of her own child. A wave of sorrow washed over her as she remembered that her mother had passed away before her baby was born. Overcome with emotion, she wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her tight as tears streamed down her face. Her mother, puzzled by her daughter's sudden outburst of emotion, held her close, comforting her as best as she could. Jingju apologized through her tears, saying she was sorry for all the trouble she had caused. Though her mother didn't fully understand what Jingju was talking about, she stroked her hair gently and whispered, "Don't cry, my dear." And for that moment, Jingju let herself cry in her mother's arms, knowing that soon, these tender moments would be gone forever. Bondo was walking down the street when he happened to spot Jingju. Seeing her, he decided to offer her a ride home. As they made their way back, they started talking about Huno. During their conversation, Jingju grew frustrated and scolded Bondo. She asked if he even knew how to use a phone because he had failed to answer her call when it had been really important. Jingju had tried to reach out to him when she realized she was being followed by Hinsu, but Bondo didn't pick up. This left Jingju feeling deeply disappointed. She quietly expressed how she might have placed too much hope in him. Every time she needed him the most, he was never there. After saying this, she turned away from Bondo and went inside the house, her disappointment obvious. Bondo was left feeling overwhelmed with guilt. Memories of the time when Jingju's mother passed away flooded his mind. He had been unable to be there for her due to an unexpected incident. Because of this, Jingju hadn't been able to see her mother one last time. Lost in thought, Bondo suddenly looked up and saw his mother-in-law standing right in front of him. She recognized him as the man who had helped her before. Bondo held great respect for her and immediately moved to assist her with her belongings. But just then, his mother-in-law surprised him by asking if he was Sojin. Bondo was taken aback by this. She thanked him for his help the day before, but made it clear she didn't appreciate anyone who made her daughter cry. She had thought, at first, that Jingju had been crying every night over some young man. Hearing this made Bondo feel extremely uncomfortable. As his mother-in-law was preparing to leave, Bondo finally introduced himself as Choi Bondo. Upon realizing that he wasn't Sojin, she quickly apologized and handed him 2 peaches, explaining that Jingju loved them. She had bought extra just for her daughter. After returning home, Bondo placed the peaches on the table, but seeing them there only deepened his guilt. He remembered a time when Jingju's sister had sent them fruit. Back then, Jingju had hesitated, asking them to exclude the peaches because Bondo was allergic to them. Because of this, Jingju had not eaten a single peach since their marriage. Reflecting on this, Bondo felt a deep sadness. Overwhelmed, he reached for alcohol, drinking to dull the emotions swirling inside him. The next morning, Bondo woke up and looked around the room, feeling a strange sense of disorientation. It seemed as though he had traveled back in time. He even heard Jingju calling his name. Without thinking, he rushed over to her and hugged her tightly, tears of joy running down his face. He truly believed they had returned to the future together. But as he turned around, Jingju vanished, and Bondo realized that the entire scene had just been a dream. After the couple had traveled back to their university days, Bondo began to appreciate just how beautiful Jingju had been back then, and how extraordinary she truly was. As he watched her, Bondo felt the weight of his past mistakes. He realized just how much he had owed her over the years. Determined to make things right, Bondo decided to take Jingju on an adventure to relive the best parts of their youth. He borrowed his father's car and went around picking up all of their closest friends. One by one, they gathered their old group, and soon, the 6 of them set off on an unexpected journey together. It was the kind of trip that captured the spirit of youth, being with the person you love, surrounded by your best friends, and experiencing the world's beauty together, free and full of excitement. Something unexpected occurred as Bondo drove, relying solely on his memory of the area. The problem was that many of the roads had changed in the 20 years since he last drove there. As he tried to navigate, it became clear that the landscape had shifted, leaving him feeling lost and helpless. But instead of giving up, Bondo summoned the courage to keep driving, eventually leading the group to a deserted area, far from anyone else. The place was eerily quiet, and as they stepped out of the car, they glanced around in confusion, unsure of what they could do for fun in such a desolate spot. Luckily, Bondo and his friends had come prepared. They had brought along plenty of food and drinks, and soon, they were grilling meat and enjoying cold beers together. There was something magical about being there, not because of the location itself, but because they were together. It was as if the joy of youth wasn't tied to any specific destination, but to the people you shared it with. Sitting around the fire, the 6 friends laughed, joked, and played together. But amidst all the fun, Bondo found his thoughts drifting back to his younger days. He couldn't help but reminisce about the person he used to be, reflecting on the time that had passed. Jinggu, noticing Bondo's distant gaze, quickly understood what he was feeling. Her own memories stirred as she thought about the times they had spent together, recalling how happy they had been when they first got married. In that moment of shared reflection, both Bondo and Jinggu couldn't hold back their emotions, and tears filled their eyes at the same time. The next morning, they woke up like wanderers, startled by the loud voices of workers. It turned out the quiet, empty place where they had camped was actually a construction site. The workers had arrived early, and Bondo's group, still half asleep, began to stir. Jinggu and her 2 best friends were woken up as well, but when they looked at each other, they burst into laughter. Their faces were covered in streaks of dirt and ash from the campfire, and they looked utterly ridiculous. Once they packed up and got back on the road, they continued their journey, this time heading toward the beach. As they drove, Bondo glanced over at Jinggu, who still had some smudges on her face, and he couldn't help but laugh heartily. Jinggu, however, was already deep in thought, imagining how she could get back at him for laughing at her, maybe even plotting a hilarious revenge in her mind. Before long, they reached the coast, and as soon as they saw the vast, endless ocean spread out before them, excitement filled the car. They all quickly jumped out and ran toward the shore, splashing in the water and enjoying the cool waves. Bondo watched Jingu's carefree smile, and in that moment, he felt truly happy inside. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt just right and all the worries seemed to disappear. As the day went on, the group decided to head to a hotel to book rooms for the night. But just as they were about to make their way to the hotel, Bondo was taken by surprise. Nam Gil, an old acquaintance, suddenly showed up, leaving Bondo wide-eyed in disbelief. As it turned out, some of their friends had secretly invited Nam Gil with the hope of setting him up with Jingu. The idea was to bring Nam Gil and Jingu closer together, but the sight of him made Bondo uneasy. Nam Gil stood there in a formal suit, looking completely out of place in the relaxed beachside setting. Bondo couldn't hide his annoyance. Glaring at Nam Gil, he sarcastically asked, "Why are you wearing a suit on a trip? Is there something wrong with your brain?" His tone made everyone at the table feel uncomfortable. During dinner, Bondo took it a step further. When he served oysters to everyone, he made a point of giving Nam Gil only a single clam. "Why wear such uncomfortable clothes here?" Bondo asked, still mocking him. Nam Gil, however, remained calm, explaining that he wasn't uncomfortable at all and had simply come to enjoy the fresh air. Bondo, clearly irritated, shot back, "You came all the way here just for fresh air?" Despite Nam Gil's attempt to keep things civil, Bondo refused to let it go, continually directing snide remarks toward him. Meanwhile, Jingu, who had been quietly sipping her drink, accidentally spilled water on herself. Seeing this, Bandu jumped up to help her wipe it off, but the whole scene made Namgil feel awkward. In reality, it wasn't water that had spilled on Jingu. It was beer, and the sticky mess prompted her to realize she needed to change clothes. Luckily, Bo-Rome and her boyfriend had come prepared. They had brought a couple of extra shirts with them, saving the day as Jingu quickly changed into something clean. The group, despite the awkward tension, continued with their evening, but Bandu couldn't shake his unease about Namgil's presence. Gil looked at Jingju and asked if he could borrow one of the shirts she had. He explained that the uniform he was wearing was quite uncomfortable. Just as Gil reached out to grab one of the shirts, Bondo swiftly snatched it from his hands. Neither of them wanted to let go. And what started as a simple request quickly escalated into a heated argument. Jingju, sitting next to them, felt at a loss, unsure how to calm things down. She racked her brain for a solution, trying to think of a way to handle the situation peacefully. In the end, the two men somehow ended up wearing matching couples' shirts. Oddly enough, they looked rather good together. What no one expected, though, was that these two men were actually rivals in love. People passing by couldn't help but smile at the sight of them wearing matching outfits. Despite the amusing scene, Jill and Bondo, being so uncomfortable with each other, decided to walk in opposite directions to avoid further conflict. Later, they all returned to the hotel. Both Gil and Bondo were quick to change into different clothes, not wanting to stay in those couples' shirts for long. Feeling restless and bored, Jingju decided to go for a walk on her own. She took a small path leading up the mountain, but she hadn't gone far when she bumped into Namgil. The two of them ended up walking together, chatting casually as they strolled along the peaceful trail. Meanwhile, after Bondo finished packing his things, he also went out, hoping to find Jingju. By this time, Jingju and Namgil had wandered off to a very special spot. There they were greeted by a breathtaking sight. The night sky was full of fireflies, and the moon hung high above, casting a soft, magical glow over everything. Jingju was completely taken aback by the beauty of the scene. She stood there, frozen in awe, unable to move as she soaked in the moment. Noticing how entranced she was, Gil quickly took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders to keep her warm. Then, in a natural motion, he gently pulled her into his arms. For Gil, it felt like taking off his jacket had been a good decision after all. He had found an opportunity to be close to Jingju, but this tender moment wasn't unnoticed. Bondo, who had been looking for Jingju, stumbled upon the scene and stood at a distance, silently watching as Gil embraced his ex-wife. A wave of discomfort and sadness washed over him as he helplessly observed the interaction, feeling something deep within him stir. The following day, their trip came to an end. One of their friends, sensing the ongoing tension between the group, decided to create a little scheme. They took all the luggage from the trunk and piled it onto the seats of the car. The plan was to force Jingju to ride with Namgil. Just as Jingju was about to get into the car, her friend pointed out that there wasn't enough room and suggested that she should ride with Namgil instead. Bondo, however, objected, insisting that there was still space in the car. Jingju hesitated, looking from Bondo to Namgil. In the end, she felt bad for Namgil and didn't want him to drive back alone, so she chose to ride with him. Once they returned to school, Jingju had an unexpected problem. She realized she had gotten her period and quickly ran to the bathroom. However, in her rush, she discovered that she hadn't packed any sanitary pads in her bag. Panicked, she called her friends, but unfortunately, both of their phones were left in the classroom, and no one answered her call. After a moment of thinking, she decided to call Bondo. It was a bit awkward, but she didn't have many other options. At that very moment, Bondo was already at the pharmacy, buying her some painkillers. When Jingju called him, she casually asked him if he could also pick up some sanitary pads for her. Without hesitation, Bondo agreed, as if it were the most normal request in the world. Afterward, Bondo made his way to the entrance of the women's restroom, ready to help Jingju out once again. Bando was feeling uneasy, unsure of how to hand over the items. He stood there, deep in thought, trying to come up with a plan. Just then, out of nowhere, two of his friends appeared behind him, giving him a surprise. One of them playfully kicked him, and as a result, the contents of Bando's bag spilled all over the ground. His friends saw what had fallen out and immediately started teasing him, questioning why he would bring such things to school. They laughed, mocking him, but Bando didn't seem to be bothered by their comments. At that moment, he noticed Jingu's friends nearby and decided to ask them a favor. Without making a fuss, He asked them to give the items to Jingu on his behalf. After handing over the sanitary pads, Bando quietly walked away, not waiting for any more teasing or questioning. Meanwhile, Jingu had just come out of the bathroom, looking pale and in obvious discomfort. She slowly slumped over her desk, clearly in pain. When her friends tried to invite her to lunch, she refused, too drained to even consider eating. She was about to take some painkillers when Bando appeared again, this time holding a cup of hot water. Gently, he reminded her, just as he had many times before, that she should always take her medicine with water, not soda. Instead of showing gratitude, Jingu snapped at him, irritated by his interference, but Bando didn't take it personally. He knew she was hurting, and didn't mean it. Instead, he quietly placed his bag on her desk, offering it as a pillow, and began to softly pat her back. It was something he had always done for her during times like these, knowing that her periods often caused her severe back pain. In the past, he had stayed by her side, day or night, gently comforting her with this same gesture. As Jingu felt his familiar touch, memories of happier times they had shared together flashed through her mind. Despite their current tensions, there had been good moments, times when they cared for one another. As Bando continued to comfort her, his eyes drifted to her hand, noticing the mark left behind by her missing ring. For a moment, he was lost in thought, looking down at the faint mark on his own finger where his ring used to be. This simple observation stirred something inside him, making him wonder if their unexpected journey to the past had something to do with those rings. Maybe, just maybe, if they found the rings again, they could return to their rightful place in the future. Bando's thoughts were interrupted as he walked across the campus, his mind still focused on the rings. Suddenly, a luxurious car pulled up beside him. Inside the car sat a wealthy girl, Ayes, who had been watching Bando with curiosity. She had taken an interest in him, but Bando wasn't in the mood for any distractions. He quickened his pace, trying to avoid her. Just as he was about to walk away, Ayes spoke up, asking about Jingu, the girl who had been with him the other day. She mentioned that she had heard rumors about Huck looking for Jingu and possibly trying to start a fight. Hearing this, Bando's mood changed instantly. His face darkened with anger, and without wasting another second, he stormed into the medical department. Without uttering a single word, Bando charged straight at Huck, his rage boiling over. He threw a punch, hitting Huck hard, and followed it up with more blows. All the memories of enduring Huck's bullying in the past flooded his mind. He had swallowed his pride so many times before, even going so far as to apologize to Huck just to keep the peace. But this time was different. Huck had hurt Jingu, the person Bando cared for most in the world, and Bando couldn't let that go. It didn't matter what the cost was, even if it meant putting himself in danger. In this moment, Bando was consumed by his love for Jingu. Sometimes a husband's love isn't expressed through sweet words or small gestures. In moments of crisis, that love shows itself in the willingness to stand up, to fight, and to protect. Bando would shield Jingu from anything, no matter what it took. Later that evening, Bando called Jingu. He told her he was standing outside her door, holding a box of grapes. He waited there, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to fix everything. As he stood there, he couldn't help but wonder why his life always seemed to be in chaos. Despite his efforts, despite always trying to live honestly and do the right thing, nothing ever seemed to go the way he hoped. Whether it was today or 10 years ago, everything still felt like a mess. At that moment, Bando was overwhelmed with a deep sense of self-blame. He regretted his immature actions from years ago, actions that had deprived Jingu of the chance to see her mother for the last time. This guilt had been a constant weight on his heart ever since. Every day, as they faced each other, Bando forced himself to smile, regardless of the frustrations and challenges he faced in the world outside. But the second he stepped into their home, he made sure that a smile was always on his face. However, this very behavior, his forced cheerfulness, led Jingu to misunderstand his feelings. To her, it seemed like the death of her mother didn't matter to Bando, that he was unaffected by her loss. This misunderstanding deepened the resentment between them. The tension between them grew stronger and stronger with each passing day, until it reached a point where neither of them could hold on anymore. Eventually, they chose to end their marriage and divorced. But even after that decision, Bando's regrets lingered. He genuinely wanted to make up for the things he hadn't done, to repair the mistakes he had made. Now, standing there in front of Jingu, he felt utterly vulnerable. His guilt was clear on his face, and Jingu, seeing his fragile state, didn't know what to say. Just then, Jingu's mother unexpectedly opened the door and stepped out. Seeing the serious expressions on Bondo and Jingu's faces, she was immediately confused. Her mind raced, thinking that maybe there was some unspoken matter between the two of them. Sensing her mother's confusion, Jingu quickly reassured her, telling her that a classmate had gone through some unfortunate events and asking her to go back inside. However, her mother didn't seem to catch on. Instead, she turned to Bondo and asked if he had eaten yet. Without waiting for his reply, she invited him inside for a meal. During the meal, Jingu's mother picked up a piece of fish and placed it gently on Bondo's spoon. The gesture stirred memories within him. It reminded Bondo of all the times in the past when he had come over for dinner, and Jingu's mother would always offer him some fish, her way of showing kindness and care. Sitting there now, looking at his mother-in-law's familiar face, countless thoughts flooded his mind. Memories of happier times, regret for the things that had gone wrong, and the weight of the unspoken tension between him and Jingu. After the meal, Jingu's mother, as always, kindly escorted Bondo to the door. Jingu, sensing the need for a more private conversation, asked her mother to go back inside while she and Bondo stayed outside to talk. Bondo's guilt still weighed heavily on him. He looked at Jingu and admitted, with a heavy heart, that she had been right all along. Every time she had needed him, he wasn't there for her. He thought he could protect her from everything, but he now understood why she had told him that she wasn't happy. Jingu didn't need him to protect her or to provide for her. All she had ever wanted was for Bondo to be by her side. She wanted them to face life's challenges together, to support their family as partners, to cry together when things got tough, and to share the weight of their struggles. She explained that, even though time had passed, Bondo needed to understand that their marriage had always been about both of them. There had been moments when they both resented each other, but those feelings were never dealt with. Instead, they were buried and allowed to fester, eventually leading them to where they were now. Sometimes, Jingu explained, all she wanted was for Bondo to hold her and cry with her. Hearing this, Bondo felt deeply troubled. He realized how much he had misunderstood her needs back then. At the time, he had thought his only role was to make her happy, to ensure that she was always smiling. He hadn't realized that sometimes just being there with her, even in sadness, was what she needed most. As the two of them sat there, looking at each other, their eyes filled with tears, they were both filled with the desire to find a way forward, a way to repair the past and step into the future together once again. The next morning, Bondo and Jingu made their way to the school library with high hopes of finding some clues about time travel. They spent hours combing through countless books, articles, and records, yet none of the information they found seemed to be of any help. Frustration was starting to set in when Bondo suddenly noticed something unusual, a faint ring mark on Jingu's hand. His curiosity got the better of him, and he asked her when it had appeared. Jingu paused for a moment and then explained that it had been there ever since she had traveled back in time. At that moment, Bondo had a realization. The rings, the very ones Jingu was wearing, were the key to their mysterious ability to travel through time. With newfound urgency, Bondo set off on a mission to find the other ring. He visited numerous jewelry shops, one after the other, tirelessly searching. Finally, after what felt like an endless journey, he spotted the rings in a small store. Without a second thought, he purchased them. Excited and determined, Bondo made his way back to find Jingu. But as he approached, he saw something that made him pause. There she was, hugging her mother with a tenderness that touched him deeply. The memory of the warm family dinner at her house flashed through his mind. Jingu laughing, her eyes sparkling as she shared moments with her mother. Bondo could see how much she treasured these moments. His heart wavered. Should he take her back to the future, knowing it would mean tearing her away from the mother she cherished so much? He decided to wait, choosing to observe quietly from afar, giving her more time. Meanwhile, Jingu and her mother had gone out for a walk in the neighborhood. As they were strolling down the street, a loud commotion broke out nearby. A drunk man was causing a scene, stumbling and shouting incoherently. Seeing this disheveled man reminded Jingu of something Bondo had once told her, about the difficulties he had faced. He had endured so much in his life, struggling day after day just to make ends meet, much like the man standing before her. He had suffered silently, never losing hope, determined to give his family a better life, no matter how suffocating the burden of life was. As they walked back home, Jingu's mind was flooded with thoughts about Bondo. She couldn't shake the image of the man's struggle, and she now understood the depth of Bondo's hardships. When they finally reached her house, an overwhelming need to see Bondo seized her. She decided to call him. At that very moment, Bondo was sitting alone, drinking, trying to drown the weight of his sorrows. The bottle in his hand felt heavy, like the burden he had been carrying for so long. Just then, his phone rang. Startled, he answered, and was surprised to hear Jingu's voice on the other end, sobbing uncontrollably. She asked where he was, her voice shaky and desperate. Bandu's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. His voice quivered as he asked where she was, and when she told him, he rushed out the door without a second thought. Jingu, waiting at a red light, watched the busy street in a daze when suddenly, out of nowhere, a small child darted into the road, chasing after a ball. Jingu's heart raced as she saw a car speeding toward the child. Without thinking, she ran after the child, determined to save them from the oncoming vehicle. Just as she reached the child and pushed them to safety, the car was almost upon her. In a split second, she felt someone shove her out of the way. Time seemed to freeze as she realized it was Bandu who had come out of nowhere to protect her. He took the full impact of the car. Jingu's world shattered. She ran to Bandu's side, screaming his name, but he didn't respond. No matter how loud she cried or how much she pleaded, Bandu lay there motionless. Panic set in as they rushed him to the hospital. Jingu felt as though the world had collapsed around her. She fell to the ground outside the hospital, overcome with grief and despair. Her tears wouldn't stop, and her cries echoed through the empty halls. Namil, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, stood nearby, realizing how deeply Bandu had rooted himself in Jingu's heart. Hours passed like days as Jingu waited for news on Bandu's condition. Finally, the doctor said he had survived the critical stage, but when she tried to visit him, Bandu refused to see her. It was as though he had shut himself off from the world, wanting to shield Jingu from any more pain. Yet Jingu wouldn't give up. She sat on a bench outside his hospital room, refusing to leave, determined to be by his side. It was only when Bandu's friends arrived that Jingu found a way in. Pretending to be a friend, she finally entered his room. Her heart broke as she saw Bandu lying there, his face pale and weak. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time, she truly understood just how much Bandu had sacrificed for her, how deeply he had cared, and how much he had endured, all for the sake of their love. That day, Jinju thought that Bandu had left this world. For a brief moment, terror gripped her. She felt as if every cell in her body had frozen. It reminded her of the feeling when her mother had passed away. Bandu, noticing the fear in her eyes, immediately understood that Jinju was deeply worried about him. With a gentle reassurance, he told her he was fine. He said that as long as she wasn't hurt, that would be enough for him. Bandu knew deep down that he hadn't given Jinju the life she deserved, but his greatest wish was for her to stay safe and healthy. If they couldn't go back to their old life, he hoped she would forget about him and start anew, because he no longer had the confidence to make her happy. Jinju, hurt by his words, asked Bandu what would happen to their child. Was he willing to abandon his own child as well? To Bandu, Jinju meant more than anything else, even more than a child who was just in his thoughts. Jinju couldn't find the right words to respond to that. Later, while Bandu was lying in the hospital, he stared at the wedding rings on his hand, overwhelmed by guilt. He regretted all his mistakes, especially toward their child. Back at home, Jinju sobbed in her mother's arms throughout the night. She was faced with a painful choice. If she stayed with her mother, she would lose Sojin. But if she chose Sojin, she would lose her mother. This impossible decision tore at her heart. Her mother could do nothing but hold her tightly and try to comfort her. The next day, Namgil came to visit Jinju at home. When she opened the door in her pajamas, Namgil was surprised. Jinju, however, was in no mood to see anyone or go out. But when Namgil mentioned that it was his birthday, she couldn't find it in her heart to refuse. So, she agreed to go out and celebrate with him. Namgil had prepared a small box of kimbap for the occasion and proudly handed it to her. He told her he woke up early to get it ready, but Jinju could immediately tell it was store-bought. Namgil, with a sheepish smile, admitted that he had only prepared it, not made it himself. Jinju didn't say anything, and took a piece to eat, not wanting to hurt his feelings. The two spent the day having fun together. Later in the evening, they sat on a swing and started talking. Their conversation eventually shifted toward the topic of mothers. As they spoke, Jinju couldn't help but think about the struggles of raising a child. She had transformed from a naive girl into someone who forced herself to become strong. The weight of those responsibilities and fears was something all mothers felt. At the end of the day, she realized, a mother is just an ordinary person trying her best. Namgil listened closely, and hearing Jinju's words only made him feel more certain of how kind and warm-hearted she was. His affection for her grew even deeper. Jinju wasn't surprised when Namgil confessed his feelings for her. She walked over to him, wrapped her arms around him, and thanked him for liking her. Namgil had helped Jinju rediscover that she was not just a mother or a woman burdened by responsibilities, but also a girl with dreams and feelings. But even with that gratitude, Jinju could only apologize for not being able to return his love. For Namgil, this bittersweet moment felt like the perfect closure. After returning home, Jinju sat quietly, staring at the floor. She was lost in thought when her mother suddenly walked into the room. With a gentle smile, her mother asked if Jinju would like to have a drink with her, offering comfort in the only way she knew how. Jingu sat down with her mother, and they began to share a drink together. In that peaceful moment, Jingu felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. She laid her head gently on her mother's lap, feeling a sense of security and happiness wash over her. But then, something unexpected happened. Her mother softly spoke, telling her to go back to her child. Jingu immediately sat up, surprised. Her mother had been cleaning her room earlier and had stumbled upon something. A letter. This letter was something Jingu had written, something she never meant for her mother to see. When her mother opened it, she found a secret Jingu had been hiding. The words in the letter, combined with Jingu's strange behavior over the past few days, revealed everything her mother needed to know. Though it was hard to accept at first, her mother slowly began to understand what was going on. To make sure, she decided to read through Jingu's diary. In it, she found a list. 5 things Jingu had wanted to do. The first was to visit a bar. The second, to take a bath with her mother. The third, to go to karaoke with her mother. The fourth was to share a drink with her mother. And the last one, the most heart-wrenching of all, was to say goodbye to her mother. Jingu, seeing that her secret was now out in the open, didn't know how to respond. She felt exposed and didn't know what to say. But her mother didn't seem angry. Instead, she gently told her that while children could eventually live without their parents, parents could never abandon their children. Overwhelmed with emotion, Jingu burst into tears. She clung tightly to her mother, knowing this might be the last embrace they'd share. It was in that moment Jingu realized the true blessing of her journey back in time. Being able to be with her mother again, something she cherished above everything else. Meanwhile, Andu was still in the hospital, surrounded by other families and their children. He felt an aching longing for his own child. The more he thought about it, the more he knew what he needed to do. He decided to return to the future. Without hesitation, he rushed to Jingu's house, running as fast as he could. Finally, he reached an intersection, and there, standing quietly, was Jingu. The moment Jingu saw Andu, she smiled softly and said, "Let's go home." Hearing those words, Andu was overcome with emotion. He rushed toward her, hugging her tightly as tears streamed down his face. Together, they returned home. Once there, Jingu's mother took her hand gently and spoke from the heart. She told her that if there ever came a time when Jingu had to leave without her, she needed to take good care of her father. Jingu's mother, despite all her love for Jingu, was most worried about her husband. She feared that if she were no longer around, he would be left alone, lost in his loneliness. Jingu promised her mother that she would always take care of her father, reassuring her that he wouldn't be left to face the world on his own. As the night came to an end, Andu and Jingu sat together, quietly reflecting on everything that had happened. They gently slipped their wedding rings back on each other's fingers and shared a deep, loving kiss. It was a moment of reconnection, of healing. The next morning, when Jingu woke up, she was no longer in the past. She had returned to the future. She looked around and saw her little child sleeping peacefully beside her. A wave of mixed emotions flooded her heart, joy at seeing her child again, but sadness at the loss of her mother all over again. Shortly after, Andu returned home too. The couple embraced their child, holding on to each other tightly as they cried. It wasn't just sadness, it was a deep longing for the love and connection they had experienced. But in that moment, they also realized something important. Love in a marriage never truly disappears. It can get lost, hidden beneath the weight of daily struggles, but it never goes away. Only by understanding and forgiving each other can a couple truly find happiness again. That's the key to a lasting marriage. Realizing that love never fades and learning not to take it for granted. Because love, in its purest form, is always there, waiting to be rediscovered. As this journey comes to a close, we hope you've enjoyed the story. Thank you for watching. Your support means the world to us, and it motivates us to keep bringing you new content. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you next time with more drama recaps. Goodbye for now.